Welcome back to Hammer Lord. Today we got the return of the Emperor's most loyal son, Primarch of the Space Wolves. As always, before we get the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get into the action.
In the oldest vaults beneath the Fang, there is a verse that the Skalds speak only when the fire is low, and the storm howls hard enough to shake the mountain. When the stars hang like dying embers, when the sky is torn and the seas run black, when the pack is scattered to the void, then shall the Wolf King return mad with the hunt, crowned in the skulls of gods, across the broken firmament of the Imperium. That old saga stirred like a sleeping beast. The great rift split the night of the galaxy, from rim to rim, a raw wound of madness and crimson light. There were regions where the Astronomican's guiding blaze was no more than a faint dying coal behind storms that roared like the breath of angry gods. In the darkness of Imperium Nihilus, entire clusters of hives vanished into the howling void, their populations counted in the tens of billions reduced to a single lost entry on some overworked scribe's data slate before the data itself was swallowed. There were worlds that had known peace of a sort for generations. On those worlds, the first sign of the wolf time was not an army or a fleet, but a scream. Astropathic choirs died by the thousands in their sunken sanctums. Men locked in leaded cells and bound into vast relay engines, convulsed as tides of unreality crashed through their minds. Vox recordings retrieved from a handful of spared relays captured only fragments. A voice like grinding ice, a distant howling, visions of lupine shadows closing around burning stars. Then silence, save for the wet crackle of neurons boiling in their skulls. The Indomitus Crusades, that great attempt to cauterize the wound of the rift with steel and faith, burned themselves out against the sheer scale of the catastrophe. Crusade fleets set forth by the hundreds and returned in mere fragments of their once proud numbers, or did not return at all. Entire spearhead armadas translated into the storms and simply never reappeared on any chart that still mattered. In the lightless, half of the Imperium, under skies burned red by empiric aurorae, demons and traitors feasted on isolated worlds. In the half that still knew the Emperor's beacon, Xenos empires gnawed at the edges of human space, like carrion flies around a wounded beast. Everywhere the counts were the same. Billions dead, trillions in peril, the galaxy at the edge of some final precipice. On Fenris, the sky rippled with warp fire. Curtains of luminous color twisted above the snowbound world, green and violet and corpse blue, shifting faster than mortal eyes could follow. Sometimes the light took on shapes too deliberate to be chance. The curve of a fang, the suggestion of a hunter's head thrown back in silent howl. Lightning burned in absolute silence across clouds the color of dried blood. The air tasted of metal and old graves. The world wolves felt it first. Those titanic predators, older than the Imperium itself, stalked the ice floes with hackles raised, their amber eyes fixed on the tortured sky. One by one they raised their muzzles and gave voice, a chorus of thunderous howls that rolled across frozen seas and mountain chains until even the stone of the Fang seemed to vibrate in sympathy. In the storm caves hollowed deep into those mountains, the rune priests of the Vulca Fenrica listened. Firelight painted the cavern walls in shades of ember and shadow, the flames burning a sullen blue where runes of power had been carved into the stone. Bones blackened and cracked in the coals, etched with sigils that writhed like living things. The air was thick with the smell of pine resin, burning fat, and the ozone tang of spent psychic force. Niall Stormcaller leaned upon his staff at the center of that circle, his wolf pelt heavy with frost, his beard braided with fetishes of tooth and rune-etched metal. His eyes were clouded with age, but that only made the glow behind them more obvious. He listened, not with ears of flesh, but with the senses honed over centuries of walking the knife edge between real space and the Sea of Souls. He heard the world wolves howling through miles of rock. He heard the crackle of lightning riding the warp storm overhead. He heard a deeper sound beneath all that, a grinding rumble like the shifting of tectonic plates, as if fate itself were changing its weight from one paw to another. "The gale is rising," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to come as much from the stone as from his throat. Around him, younger rune priests shifted uneasily. One, his scalp crisscrossed with ritual scars and his armor still bearing the gloss of comparatively recent campaigns, spoke first. "The Wulfen are restless, Elder," he said. "They hurl themselves against their chains until the very rock buckles. The jailers say they have never howled so long, nor so loud." Njal's lips curled back from his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. "They smell it," he said. "They feel the hunt on the air, the way a beast tastes iron before the first cut is ever made." The fire roared suddenly higher, flames flaring white as bone. In their depths, images took shape. A crusade fleet in perfect lectured formation. Then those precise lines collapsing as something unseen tore through them. A shrine world burning, its cathedra collapsing into seas of vox static. A vast lupine shadow stalking through starfire towards some unseen prey. The images flickered away as quickly as they came. The rune bones cracked with little screams and fell into ash. Njal drew a slow breath, heavy with the scent of smoke and portent. "Call the High King," he said. "The gale has turned. The wolf time's breath is on our faces." High above the storm caves, in the great hall of the Fang, Logan Grimnar felt the same cold weight settle on his shoulders. The great wolf sat upon a throne carved from living rock, the stone polished by the passage of generations. Furs from beasts whose names had passed into saga were draped across his shoulders, their pelts thick and white as fresh snowfall. His armor, wrought in Fenrisian grey and engraved with scenes of hunt and battle, bore scars from more wars than most men could name. His beard had gone from iron to snow over the long centuries, but his eyes were still chips of glacial ice, bright and dangerous. The hall around him was filled with the echoing murmur of assembled wolf lords, wolf guard and scolds. Fenrisian torches smoked in their brackets, their flames guttering in tune with the distant storm. Hololithic projections flickered between the great stone pillars, unstable and grainy, displaying the madness of a galaxy that burned. A hive city sprawled across a continent, its spires clawing at a sky blackened by ash. Firestorms marched along its hab canyons as demonic shapes writhed through the smoke. Lines of Astra Militarum, tiny in comparison to the towering Manufactoria around them, broke and reformed and broke again under waves of corrupted flesh. Lasfire and Prometheum made no impression on the sheer scale of the tide. An agri-world showed oceans turned to blood-slick slurry. Plough fields churned into trenches lined with improvised barricades of skulls. Skitari maniples fought in perfect, unfeeling patterns, their galvanic rifles cracking like distant thunder as they stood knee-deep in gore. Above them, a swarm of brass-winged demons blotted out the weak sunlight. Another feed showed a crusade fleet's last moments. Cruisers and battle barges burned in void, their void shields shattered, their hulls torn open like gutted prey. Warp lightning crawled along splintered prows, turning proud eagles into skeletal mockeries. Vox glyphs designated the fleet as a spearhead of the Indomitus Crusade, once a blade thrust into the darkness. Now it was a corpse, tumbling silently. One hololith after another stuttered and died as communion with those far-flung war zones failed. Static crawled over the displays and then guttered into nothing. "Every day there are more ghosts upon the charts," one wolf lord muttered, fingers tightening around the haft of his frost axe. "Every day," Grimnar answered, his voice knife-flat. "And every day we are asked to bleed more to fill the gaps." Njal Stormcaller entered the hall with the storm at his back, frost smoking from his furs, staff tapping on stone. Conversations died as he stepped into the light of the hololiths. He smelled of the cave fires, of rune smoke and old wolf. "You have news," Grimnar said. It was not a question. "I have omens," Njal replied. His eyes shone strangely. And then, Russ chose to underline them with iron and hull plating, as is his way. Before Grimnar could respond, the mountain itself shuddered. A long, rising howl rolled up from deeper levels, the sound of sirens tuned to the pitch of wolf voices. Fenrisian script flared along the stone arches, warning runes pulsing in urgent sequence. The vow, sigils of long slumbering auspex banks, awakened upon the hall's great wall, lines of rune light cascading down like falling ice. A serf in heavy furs and grease-stained leathers stumbled to a halt at the foot of the throne, dropping to one knee with his head bowed low. "Great Wolf!" he gasped, breath steaming in the chill air. "Warp translation in system, multiple capital signatures, ident codes. They are old, Lord, old beyond knowing. The machine spirits name the Hrafnkel, the Icefang, the Grey Widow. They were marked lost in the age of the heresy." A ripple passed through the hall. Names buried in saga and half-whispered liturgies were suddenly on every tongue. "The 13th, someone breathed. "The Lost Pack." Grimnar was already rising to his feet, the runes upon his axe flaring to life in shades of storm blue. "Bring me the outer auger feeds," he said. "Open every channel, wake every gun, and summon the Skalds. If this is a saga, I will hear it from the first word." The command bastion at the crown of the Fang was a cathedral of stone and adamantium, its far wall a single slab of armored transteel that looked out upon the void. Fenris hung below like a scarred jewel, its seas locked in ice, its land masses wreathed in storm. Beyond that, the starfield was a thing torn and bleeding, warp light seeping through the rents in reality. Against that backdrop, the returning ships crawled into view. They were relics from another age. Their hulls bore the old heraldry of the Space Wolves' Legion, before Gilliman's edicts had broken the legions into chapters. Wolf-head prows, runic script etched along their flanks, figureheads carved in the likeness of ancient Fenrisian beasts. Once, they would have been proud ships, paragons of the Great Crusade. Now, they looked like carcasses dragged from a predator's den. Armor plating was split and buckled, vast sections sloughed away and replaced with plates of mismatched metal and bone. Certain sections seemed to have partially melted and then frozen in place, as if caught halfway between realities. Blackened scars traced the outlines of demonic sigils burned into the hull, then torn out by violence from within. Great sheets of something like congealed ichor clung to the flanks, frozen hard as glass, catching the light in ugly colors. "By Russ," one wolf-lord muttered, his voice a rough whisper. "What in all the sagas did they hunt through to look like that?" The answer came with the first boarding party. Within the hangar of the Hrafnkel, buried beneath dangling chains of frozen entrails that had once belonged to things not entirely human, they found the survivor. At first glance, he seemed to be a dreadnought interred in a sarcophagus that had grown around a broken man imperfectly. Ceramite and flesh had fused in obscene ways. Cabling riddled with spidery warp burns snaked into ruined limbs. Half his face was cased in adamantium, the other half a ruin of scar tissue and exposed augmetic, one eye a dead, blind, milky orb, and the other a burning coal. When they powered the sarcophagus, the thing inside convulsed. "How long has he slept?" Grimnar asked, watching from the edge of the circle, as serfs checked warding sigils and rune priests murmured low canticles. "A long watch, my lord," Njal answered. "Longer than your beard has been white. The machine spirit would not give me an exact span. It only sent me the taste of old blood and older grief." The sarcophagus vox grill crackled. A sound like a wolf choking on its own howl scraped from within. The thing that had once been a long fang shifted, metal claw grinding against the deck. "Name yourself," Grimnar said. His voice filled the hangar like an order to fire. Static answered him at first. Then the semblance of words began to emerge, torn and jagged. "Hunt. Still. The hunt." Njal stepped closer, his staff tapping once, hard, on the deck. The sound rang through the hull in weird counterpoint. "Lift your head, old killer," he said. "You are on Fenris. You are in the shadow of the Fang. You gaze upon your High King. Speak as a son of Russ, or be silent forever." The single living eye rolled, bloodshot and wild, then fixed upon Grimnar. Recognition flickered there for a heartbeat, then drowned under a tide of memory that had no place in sane men. "No horizon," the Longfang rasped. His voice came in bursts, as if being translated from another tongue by a dying machine. "No walls, no end to the killing. We hunted until the stars bled dry. We hunted until the gods took notice." His head lolled, cables creaked. "He tears them," the old warrior whispered. "He tears the gods, the lord of winter and war. He hunts them in their own halls. He wears their crowns as collars and feeds their hearts to the pack." Njal's fingers tightened around his staff. Grimnar's teeth ground together. "Who?" the great wolf demanded. "Who hunts the gods, old brother?" The sarcophagus shuddered. The dreadnought's frame leaned forward as far as its restraints allowed. The single living eye blazed bright as a furnace. "The Wolf King," he hissed. "The Allfather's butcher, the one who left and never died. He let us run, and we never stopped. The eye could not consume him. It could only learn what it means to be prey." The vox cut out in a shriek of feedback. The old long fang slumped, steam hissing from stress vents along the sarcophagus frame. No coaxing or chiding could wrestle another word from his cracked lips. "Madness," one of the wolf lords breathed. "Prophecy," Njal corrected softly. Madness or prophecy, the galaxy did not pause to allow them time to decide. In the command bastion, hololithic emitters blazed again, this time forming a larger, more intricate image. Sector charts unfolded in howling runes. Front lines crawled with kill markers. Entire campaigns annotated with skull sigils where communication had ceased. Vox links crackled as the Fang reached out across light years to what allies and commanders still possessed the strength or luck to answer. Logan Grimnar strode to the center of the chamber, the great wolf's presence anchoring the swirling data with the weight of his attention. "Patch them through," he growled. "All of them. I will see this breaking galaxy with my own eyes." Faces and icons flared into being around him in a shifting circle. A Lord Admiral whose eyes were sunk in sleepless hollows, naval cap perched askew on hair gone grey too early. A Lord General militant in battered plate, his once splendid uniform smoke-stained. A Magos whose flesh was almost entirely replaced with humming metal, his organic eye the only betrayer of unease. Reports overlapped, but the story was the same. Black Legion spearheads ripping into segmentum defenses like jagged blades. Renegade chapters of Astartes, running ahead of them in murderous packs, culling worlds that had survived the first storms only to fall in a second wave. Cult uprisings on a scale that turned entire subsectors into open wounds of revolt and sacrifice. "Entire crusade groups have vanished," the Lord Admiral said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Mustered fleets that numbered in the hundreds of warships. Gone. Not even wreckage left in their wake. The Guard bleeds on a dozen major fronts," the Lord General militant snarled, one fist slamming against a hololithic projection, sending runes rippling. "On Hrothgar's gate alone we have deployed more regiments than most sectors muster in total. And still the heretics come, and the demons. A black crusade renewed, my lords, with strength that should not exist. The eye vomits forth armies without end. The Magos spoke, Vox speech flattening his tone into cold, measured logic. A demon tide of this magnitude should not be sustainable, he said. Yet analysis of noospheric data suggests that the warp is being fed from some deeper well of slaughter. Casualty projections for the next standard century become meaningless. The figures rise beyond bounds that our models can map. Grimnar listened. He let the weight of the words sink into him like fresh scars. "It is the wolf time," Niall said, breaking the dark hum of reports. His staff traced a rune in the air, leaving a brief trail of ghostly light. The old saga speaks plainly, if any had ears to hear. When the pack is scattered to the void, when the sky is torn, when the stars burn like dying embers, then shall the Wolf King return. "We have been at the brink since the rift tore the sky," Grimnar said. "Are you telling me we have gone beyond even that?" Niall's gaze slid to the hololith, showing the crippled Hrafnkel and her sister ships limping through the void over Fenris, their damaged hulls leaving trails of frozen demon ichor. "I am saying the brink is behind us, High King," he answered. "We are running along the cliff's face now, and something is climbing up from the darkness below to meet us." On the shrine world of Hrothgar's Gate, the galaxy proved him right. The world hung in the darkness like a votive flame, its surface a web of cathedral cities and pilgrimage spires. Its atmosphere was choked with the contrails of aircraft and the ash of 1,000 sanctified pyres. It had stood as a beacon of faith for centuries uncounted. On the day the wolf time truly began, it became a charnel house. The first signs were subtle. The sun dimmed, as if a thin veil had been pulled over its face. Vox channels filled with interference, bursts of static that sounded unnervingly like distant howls. The high choirs in the principal basilica fell silent mid-hymn, their voices cutting off, as if the throats producing them had simply closed. Then the sky tore open. Demonic sigils, cut in lines of impossible geometry and burning with baleful light, carved themselves across the firmament. Warp fire licked down through the thin veil of atmosphere, turning clouds into boiling, screaming vapor. The air tasted of copper and old graves. Men fell to their knees in the streets, clutching their heads as whispered promises and threats crawled through their minds. Hrothgar's Gate answered with everything it had. Regiments of Astra Militarum, drawn from harsh war worlds and civilized hive clusters alike, formed lines along the great processional ways and in the shadow of towering reliquaries. Their numbers ran into the tens of billions. Armored columns thundered through sanctified squares, Leman Russ battle tanks and baneblades grinding the icons set into the cobbles under their tracks. Skitarii legions marched in lockstep along the buttresses of cathedral spires, their galvanic rifles oiled and ready. The enemy fell on them like a fever. Warp breaches ripped open along the horizon, disgorging tides of flesh and brass. Demons poured from the rents in reality, shapes both bestial and mockingly human, blades of soul light in their hands. Cultists swarmed up from below, bursting from sewer mouths and forgotten tomb vaults, their bodies daubed in symbols that crawled like living wounds. The air turned red with lasfire. Shells screamed. The hymns of the faithful became battle cries, then death rattles. On Fenris, in the command bastion, they watched. Vox picked feeds from Hrothgar's Gate burned across the hololiths, shaky and intermittently devoured by static. Grimnar saw a guardsman in a filth-streaked flak coat, standing waist-deep in a trench filled with his own dead, firing a lasgun on full auto until the barrel glowed, his face contorted in something that might have been prayer or madness. He saw Skitarii march in lockstep into a tide of brass-clad demons, their limbs severed and heads cut away in precise, almost beautiful arcs. He saw the sky. Behind the glyphs and the fire, a shadow moved. It was not a shape in any mortal sense. It was an absence, a blackness against the warp light, a void with the suggestion of eyes and teeth, and a lupine head turned toward the world below. For a heartbeat, as the feed flared and died, it seemed to Grimnar that the shadow bent closer, sniffing, as if testing the scent of this particular offering of slaughter. Then Hrothgar's gate vanished. The Pict stream burned white. Vox screamers howled and then burst, showering nearby serfs in molten metal. When the systems were dragged back under control, there was no image to retrieve. No orbiting auger arrays reported a planet where Hrothgar's gate had once hung. There was only a smear of lingering warp light, fading like blood diluted in black water. Silence fell in the command bastion. Logan Grimnar turned away from the dead hololith. He said no word as he left the chamber, the wolf lords and mortal commanders stepping aside before him. Njal watched him go, a knowing grief in his old eyes. The great wolf climbed. He ascended through the Fang's inner ways, past armories filled with relic blades and halls where the skulls of 1,000 conquered beasts stared down at him from the walls. He walked until the air grew thin and bit at his lungs, until the muffled thunder of the storm sounded close enough to touch. At the summit, he stepped out onto the wind-scoured platform that crowned the fortress monastery. Fenris spread around him, ice and rock and storm-churned sea. The sky above was a mad river of warp light and lightning, colors shifting too fast for sane thought to catalogue. Grimnar stood bareheaded to it, his long beard tearing in the gale, his hand tight around the haft of his axe. Below, across the ice fields and the frozen seas, the world wolves howled. They howled in hunting packs. They howled alone on distant floes. They howled from the foot of the Fang and from islands far beyond sight. The sound rose and merged, pack answering, pack until it became something else entirely. A single, vast, impossible cry that seemed to shake the bones of the world. Grimnar felt it hammer through him, through the rock beneath his feet, through the thin membrane between real space and the Sea of Souls. In the warp, that howl became light. It surged out from Fenris like a spear of cold blue radiance, ripping through currents of crimson and black. Lesser demons scattered before it, their half-born minds shrieking. Sorcerers on distant warships staggered as their auguries were shattered, their familiars driven to claw out their own eyes. The howl reached the Eye of Terror. There, in that eternal storm, it did not dissipate. It was caught. Something vast turned, something old and terrible and hungry. For the first time in many long centuries, the predator's gaze lifted from its endless hunt and fixed upon the dim reflection of the Emperor's light. Logan Grimnar stood upon the Fang, his beard lashed by the storm, and listened. For a heartbeat, for a span of time too small to have a name, he heard another sound answer from very far away. A sound like a single wolf's howl cutting through a battlefield, a sound edged with laughter and the ring of steel on bone. Then the wind howled louder, and that ghost sound was gone. The wolf time, Grimnar said into the storm, his voice carried away on the gale. So be it. Below him, the world wolves howled on, and in the Eye of Terror, something began to move. The Eye of Terror did not have a sky. It had a wound. It stretched above the demon world in jagged bands of color that were not colors at all, a churning tapestry of claw marks and teeth marks and gouges where things with no shape had torn at reality and left their rage behind. The air shivered with a perpetual storm of sound that was almost, but not quite, a howl. It might have been the echo of every battle ever fought in the name of war, trapped and looped until it became a single, endless roar. Below that bleeding vault lay the realm of a thing that thought itself a god. It was a world of frozen battlefields, layer upon layer upon layer. Titans lay half buried in ice that was not ice, their colossal frames locked mid-stride, weapons still raised, Their god-machine skulls turned toward the heavens in an agony that had never ended. Giants of the Legiones Astartes lay scattered among them, legion colors leached away, ceramite and bone fused into jagged statues, each locked into the pose in which it had died. Where the ice thinned, seas of broken blades and shattered armor glittered, grinding against one another like teeth. The wind that scoured those plains was a blizzard of razored snow and flensing ash, each grain a splinter of some slain soul, screaming as it scoured paint and flesh alike. It flayed demons down to their spite and stripped lesser mortals to bone in moments. It sang through the hollowed rib cages of fossilized war engines and tore at the banners that still hung from their rusted armor plates, reducing once proud heraldry to frayed ghosts. Through that storm, something walked that the warp itself had failed to break. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, the Wolf King of Fenris, the Emperor's executioner, strode across the frozen plains as if they were no more than old snow on his home world. His cloak was in tatters, patched and repatched with the hides of beasts that had never lived in real space. The furs were black where warp fire had kissed them, white where frost had crystallized them, and slick with old, half-remembered blood. His armor was a patchwork of heresy-era plate and trophies torn from demon princes and traitor lords, its rune-etched surfaces burning with a cold light that had nothing to do with the storm. In his hand, he carried a spear. It had once been the spear of Russ, a weapon of such legend that mortals sang of it as if it were a war spirit in its own right. Now it had changed, as its master had changed. The blade seemed to drink the light around it, the metal dark and hungry, edged in a glare that was painful to look upon. Demonic ichor and something that might have been molten soul dripped from it in slow, viscous drops, hissing as they hit the frozen ground, burning holes down through layers of petrified battle until they vanished into depths no eye had ever seen. He moved easily, as if this place were only another hunting ground. Around him stalked his pack. They were the remnants of the 13th Great Company, the lost hunters of the heresy, and the Wolf Guard and Grey Hunters, who had followed their Primarch into the wound in the sky when the last great wars of brother against brother had ended with so little justice and so much blood. 10,000 years of hunting in the eye had flensed them and reforged them, but it had not broken their backs. Their armor was fused with bone, not decoration, but growth. Pale lupine ribs curled over ceramite. Breastplates, vertebrae ran along power pack housings, and skulls that were not entirely wolf and not entirely human leered from shoulder guards and helm crests. Claws of living iron had grown from gauntlets, jointed like the talons of some Fenrisian predator. Their eyes burned with a feral glow, pale as moons, bright as warp lightning, the pupils slitted and sharp. They moved like beasts and like warriors both, shoulders rolling under the weight of warplate, heads turning to scent the empiric gale. Wulfen howled among them, fully given over to the curse that had always lurked in their blood, their howls shredding the warp storm and drawing answering cries from things skulking beyond sight. None of them moved more than a handful of paces from their Primarch. He was the center of their orbit, the anchor in a sea that had no fixed points. "Realm reeks of old blood," one of the Jarls growled through fanged teeth, his vox grill translating Fenrisian into something the realm itself could not quite twist. "Stale, like a kill left too long in the snow." "Then we will freshen it," Russ answered. His voice cut across the storm, flat and amused. There was a harsh music in it, the cadence of old sagas spoken around fire pits on long winter nights. The wind bent around him in ways it did not around others, its cutting edge blunted by a presence that the warp had learned, grudgingly, to treat with caution. Ahead, the demon fortress rose. It was not built so much as grown from the carcass of the world's endless war. Mountains of skulls and shattered armor rose in tiers, fused together with brass and black stone. Rivers of congealed blood ran down channels carved in the shape of screaming faces, freezing where the wind cut across them, then cracking and flowing anew. Towers taller than titans speared up into the wound sky, their surfaces covered in writhing reliefs that showed the endless triumphs of the realm's master over enemies both mortal and immortal. At the summit, something moved. It might have been wings, it might have been horns, it might have been an idea of cruelty given shape. Whatever it was, it watched the approaching wolves with a gaze that scorched. The plain before the fortress was already occupied. Ranks upon ranks of bloodletters stood in ordered lines, their blades held in ritual salutes, eyes like burning embers fixed upon the oncoming pack. Behind them, traitor Astartes in spiked plate waited, their armor a patchwork of black and brass and dried gore, 8-pointed stars carved into their flesh and ceramite alike. Demon engines stamped and snorted, plated limbs cracking the ice as they shifted their weight, weapon muzzles glowing with a dull, hateful light. They were not innumerable, but they were close. The plain ran red with their presence. Russ did not slow. He lengthened his stride. The pack matched him, a rolling wall of warplate and fur, their booted feet cracking the frozen battlefield. Beneath them, howls built in their throats, rising from low growls to full-throated roars that shook the air. The storm gusted, seeming to hesitate, as if even the eye itself were pausing to see what would happen next. The first volley came from the traitor Astartes. Bolter fire tore the air, shells streaking out like a second storm of metal. Russ did not deign to turn aside. The rounds that hit him detonated against the fields of force and coiled runes that lay over his armor like a second skin, showering him in sparks and fragments. Those that struck his sons blew chunks from ceramite, tore away bone and fur, but the wolves did not falter. They hit the demon host like an avalanche. Russ drove into the front rank of bloodletters with a thunderous impact, his spear trailing arcs of killing light. The first demon he struck ceased to exist as anything recognizable. The blade punched through its chest, and where it had been there was only steam and a sound like a cut-off scream. The shockwave of the blow blasted lesser warp spawn aside, sending them pinwheeling through the air like leaves in a gale. The 13th crashed in around him. Chainswords and frostblades rose and fell. Demonic heads flew from serpentine necks. Barbed blades that should have cut through ceramite like parchment glanced off armor that sang with rune wards and hard-earned spite. Astartes in wolf-grey plate tore through traitor marines, ripping helms from heads with their bare hands, stamping down until skulls broke and vox grills crunched underfoot. Bloodletters swarmed up their legs like ants, hacking and screeching. Wulfen hurled themselves bodily into the press, their claws raking, their fangs snapping. Where their curse was thickest, the warp twisted, flesh flowing over armor in new, savage patterns, bones grinding and thickening. They fought like a storm given limbs. The fortress realm answered. The thing upon its summit screamed, a sound that tore fresh wounds in reality. New rents opened in the air, vomiting more demons into the melee. Rivers of crimson bodies that sprinted across the frozen plains with blades ready. The traitor Astartes roared their warped litanies and surged forward, their guns forgotten in favor of chain axes and chain blades. It did not matter. Russ moved through the heart of the slaughter, and where he went, war shifted around him. He took the arm from a traitor champion at the shoulder with a casual twist of his spear, then reversed the weapon and drove the butt into another's helm, collapsing it. He ripped a bloodletter from the air as it leaped, one hand closing around its throat, and swung it like a flail into its kin, scattering them before crushing the howling thing underfoot. His laughter, harsh and wild, cut through the battle like a challenge to the universe itself. Harder fought hunts on the sea ice, one of his jarls bellowed over the roar, driving his frost axe into the belly of a demon engine and wrenching upwards, spilling whatever hateful energies served it for life. At least there the prey did not keep screaming after you cut it in two. Give it time, another snarled, wrenching his wolf claw free from the breastplate of a fallen enemy. These ones never seem to know when to stop. They stop, Russ said, and drove his spear into the ground. The demon world shuddered. He had been watching as he fought, not just the movement of enemies and allies, not just the flow of blood and the opening and closing of gaps in the lines, but the way the realm itself breathed. He had hunted upon this plane and others like it for longer than most stars had burned. He knew the way their laws slipped and flexed, how will and word could shape them. Runes flared along the spear's shaft, burning in Fenrisian script, each one a name, an oath, a remembered kill. Russ threw back his head and howled, not in challenge, but in command. The ground split. Canyons yawned open, under the feet of the bloodletters and traitors, kilometers long, their walls lined with the skulls and armor of wars that had never happened. The demon host tried to leap back, but the realm betrayed them. Gravity twisted, angled planes folded. What had seemed like solid ground became a slick, plunging descent. They fell in their tens of thousands. Russ twisted the spear. The canyon walls closed. It was like watching a mountain range break its own spine. Towers of bone and brass slammed together, grinding down everything between them. For a moment, a forest of blades and limbs clawed upward from the closing gap. Then they were gone, flattened, pressed into a layer of new strata in the frozen battlefield. The noise of it was a grinding, bone-deep thunder that rolled outward, shaking titans and fossilized giants in their tombs of ice. The greater demon's scream broke off mid-note. Parts of the fortress slumped, its towers losing height as the bedrock of stacked corpses and armor plates shifted beneath them. River channels of congealed blood cracked, spilling their sluggish contents into fresh fissures. Demon engines stumbled, their clawed feet sinking into suddenly treacherous terrain. Realm does not love its own as it loves us, a Jarl laughed, voice rough with old scars. It knows which side of the kill feeds it, another answered. They pushed on, carving their way through the survivors, leaving a trail of fresh ruin across the already ruined world. The fortress's outer works buckled under their assault. Gateways that had stood for ages uncounted crashed down under hammer blows and melt charges. The wards etched into them, breaking apart in showers of dark light. By the time the last resistance faltered, the plain around the fortress had become a landscape of fresh death, layered atop old. They made their camp atop it. A mountain of demon corpses and shattered traitor warplate rose against the wounded sky, steam curling from the piled dead as the realm tried to decide what to do with so much sudden slaughter. Russ sat upon a throne of broken ceramite at its summit, his spear thrust into a crack between frozen titan bones, cloak wrapped around his shoulders. His sons sprawled around him, cleaning weapons, tearing strips of meat from beasts dragged from the deeper wastes, drinking from casks that had no mundane origin. The air stank of burnt warp essence and metal. The wind had died down to a sullen hiss, as if sulking. One of the Jarls, his helm removed to show a face carved by old claws and older laughter, spat a gobbet of something black into the piled corpses and leaned back on one hand. "Tell me, Lord," he said in growling Fenrisian, "does the Imperium still stand beyond the wound? Do the Allfather's kindling and his favourites still skulk behind their walls, afraid to hunt?" There was coarse humour in his words, but there was something else as well. A question even a son of Russ could not quite keep buried. They had run a long time in the dark. Even wolves could forget the feel of morning. Russ grinned. The expression showed too many teeth. There was wolf in it, and something older than wolves, something that had come to the Allfather's gene for war, like a weapon seeking a hand. "If it does," he said, "then we will remind it how to kill. If it does not, then we will build something better from its carcass." Laughter rolled around the corpse mountain, harsh and honest. Tankards were raised, blades were thumped against shields. A wolfen threw back his head and howled, the sound raw with something that was very nearly joy. It was then that the wind changed. The air had been full of the usual stink of demon worlds, betrayal and old fear, the copper-tang of souls being torn apart, the stench of burned faith, the cloying sweetness of pleasures taken and retaken until they became numb. It was a thick, clinging atmosphere, one that Russ barely noticed anymore. Now, a new scent pushed through it. Blood. Not the sour, unnatural tang of warp ichor, but the sharp, living scent of mortal blood spilled in quantities no sane mind could conceive. The smell of billions crying out at once. Layered over it, the rank breath of desperation, the smoke of burning cities, the ozone of void shields failing, and atmosphere venting in vast gouts. Real space. Russ went very still, his nostrils flared. His eyes, which had long ago taken on a feral cast, seemed to focus on something beyond the demon world's frozen horizon. The pack felt the change, even if they could not trace its source. Conversations faltered. Wolfen claws extended reflexively. Armor seals hissed as warriors shifted their weight, as if bracing against a blow they could not yet see. "Lord," one of the Jarls said quietly, "what do you smell?" "Home," Russ said. Then after a heartbeat, voice lower, rougher, and fire, a great deal of fire. The warp heaved. It was like being caught in the heart of a sudden storm at sea, the ground tilting under them, the bleeding sky folding inward. Runes flared into being around Russ, circling him in wild patterns, each one a symbol of something half-remembered from the oldest sagas. The spear of Russ shuddered in his hand, as if eager, as if it too had caught the scent. Images slammed into him. A galaxy riven by a gash of living night, its stars guttering like guttering candles. Worlds burned in chains, linked by fire and iron. A figure in cobalt armor standing amid a throne of broken imperial eagles, his face set and weary. A blade of reason in a world gone mad. Another figure, half light and half shadow, walking unseen paths with a lion's patience. Fenris, his world, ringed in fire, the Fang standing against a tide of darkness that made demon realms look like training grounds. Voices rose and fell around him in a chorus that was not a chorus. All the prayers and oaths and screams of the Imperium rolled into one endless plea. The wolf time. Russ threw back his head and laughed. It was not sane laughter. It was the sound of an avalanche tearing loose from a mountain, of ice cracking under the weight of a thaw, of a predator finally catching the scent of prey it has pursued across a frozen world. "At last," he said, rising to his feet in a fluid motion, spear dragging arcs of light through the air. "The final hunt." His pack rose with him, weapons in their hands, eyes burning. "You hear it, my sons," he called, his voice carrying across the corpse mountain, across the frozen plains, into the wound in the sky itself. The pack howls from beyond the storm. The worlds of men burn. Our kin bleed. The foes we were made to kill grow fat on their suffering. He planted the butt of his spear in the frozen ground, hard enough that fissures spidered out from the point of impact. "We have hunted gods and monsters in this place for an age," he snarled. "We have broken demon princes on these spears and cast them down into the dark. We have taught the eye what it means to fear. Now the hunt comes home. We will go back. We will tear the enemies of mankind apart, and if we find nothing left worth saving, we will drag the whole rotten carcass of this galaxy down into the grave with us." Howls answered him. The warp stuttered. The demon world, wounded by his earlier command, groaned as if under a new, greater strain. The towers of the fortress began to crack, more from the pressure of his will than from any physical blow. The sky tore wider, seams opening in the already broken vault, showing glimpses of other battlefields, other horrors, other routes through the storm. Russ hefted his spear. He drove it forward, not into flesh or ice, but into the fabric of the realm itself. The world screamed. Where the blade bit, reality parted. Not cleanly, not gently, but as if something with too many teeth were being forced to open its jaws. A wound appeared in the air, edges raw and bleeding light that was not light. Through it, for a heartbeat, Russ glimpsed stars, not the false stars of the warp, but the steady burning points of real suns, smeared and distorted by the storm, but unmistakable. The realm tried to close, to knit itself back together, to heal around the invasive spear. Runes flared along the shaft, resisting. Russ bared his teeth and leaned into the thrust, muscles bunching under scarred armor. "You had your time," he growled to the eye itself. "You gnawed at us. You tried to swallow us. You made us run your halls and hunt your monsters. Now we go to hunt in a wider forest. You do not hold us." The wound widened. Bleeding radiance spilled out, painting armor and bone and ice in shades of cold fire. The air shook with the warp's outrage, a chorus of voices shrieking in 1,000 tongues as one of its long-held trophies ripped itself free. "Through!" Russ barked. "In formation. Teeth first." The 13th needed no second bidding. They formed around him, a wedge of wolf grey and bone and burning eyes, weapons ready. Wolfen howled, the sound raw with anticipation. Armor seals locked. Runes flared along pauldrons and gauntlets, wards drawn from a dead god's throne and a living world's oldest stories. Leman Russ stepped into the wound. The warp tried to cling to him, to drag him back. It tore at his cloak, at his armor, at the edges of his mind. He shook it off with a snarl, driving forward, his sons at his back, the demon world receding behind them in a storm of impotent rage. For the first time in a very long time, the Wolf King walked toward the light of real stars. The first sign was that the stars began to die. They winked out one by one above Fenris, cold points of light swallowed by a creeping darkness that was not the night of honest void. It moved like a stain across the sky, broadening, thickening, until constellations that had burned since. The first scolds raised their voices over Fenrisian fires were gone, smothered by something vast and malign. Then the engines of the damned ignited. Warp fire burned in the black. Hulls the size of mountains slid out of unreality, shedding empiric ichor that boiled away in sheets of color. Black Legion warships in serried ranks, their prows crowned with 8 pointed stars, their flanks studded with demon mouths that screamed silently as void shields flared. Between them drifted the hulking forms of demon engines, void constructs forged from murdered god machines and bound warp entities, their frames alive with chains and hooks and burning sigils. Behind that first line came more. Warbands from a dozen traitor legions, each fleet a scar from some older war, here reforged into a spear aimed at one world. In their shadow moved renegade titans, carried in the bellies of hell-forged carriers, or walking through the void encased in fields of balefire, their god machine frames bristling, with weapons that had once defended mankind. In the heart of that host, reality tore. A wound opened above Fenris, a circle of raw, screaming crimson. It swelled, expanding until it was larger than the world below, a new, impossible moon that devoured the sky. Within the circle, shapes writhed, rivers of skulls, oceans of blood, mountains of armor and bone. The image shuddered and resolved into a single, colossal skull, its eye sockets twin suns of hungry red, its teeth jagged asteroids. It hung above the Fang like a god's threat. Every mortal on Fenris felt their bowels clench and their hearts stutter at the sight. Every space wolf felt something else beneath that. Rage, hot and clean. The enemy had come in force. The Eye had opened its jaws. The Imperium answered with everything it could tear from wider wars. Orders screamed out from segmentum commands, cutting across chains of authority and supply as if they were so much spiderweb. Entire crusade arms were redirected. Tithes were brought forward without consultation. Guard worlds that had bled for centuries were bled again, their regiments stripped and hurled toward the Fenris system. Night houses pledged their banners and marched their great engines of war into orbit. Titan Legios answered with oaths older than most of the men giving them. They came in their billions, hive worlds emptied, their underhives scraped of every man who could hold a laser gun and some who could not. Agri-worlds sent more than grain. Men from death worlds, from shrine planets, from manufactoria cities that had never seen the sky beneath their own smog, all found themselves packed into the cold metal bowels of troop ships and transport barges, their breath turning to frost as they waited to be hurled into a battle most of them would never live to see the end of. Armored columns were loaded by the million. Leman Russ battle tanks rolled up into landing craft and drop barges, their crews' faces lit by the glow of status. Runes, baneblades and shadow swords, behemoths that had fought in more campaigns than their current crews could name, were prized from museums and shrine hangars, sanctified in haste, and sent toward the gathering storm. Lines of artillery as long as continents were broken apart and reassembled into void translatable blocks. Titan Legios woke their god machines. In forged temples lit by the glow of magma seas, princeps lowered themselves into command thrones that still smelled faintly of their predecessors' burned flesh. Manifold links flared, connecting mind to engine. Titans stirred, shaking dust from their carapaces, their weapons cycling through ancient routines. Choirs of tech priests chanted Binharic hymns, their voices blending with the rising roar of reactors brought to critical life. Night households rode to war. Armored nobles in their giant walkers assembled in glittering ranks, banners snapping in recycled air, chainswords longer than habblocks purring with restrained hunger. Oaths were recited, some in archaic High Gothic, some in clipped feral tongues. All ended with the same words: for the Emperor, for the Imperium, for the survival of the species. All streams flowed toward Fenris. The Fang stood at the center of that gathering storm, a fang of rock thrust up from an ice-choked sea, its adamantium sheathing studded with gun emplacements and sensor arrays, its inner halls alive with howling. The great companies mustered. Blood claws barely out of their trials clashed chainswords together in the mustering halls, their eyes bright with a mix of fear and savage joy. Their armor still smelled faintly of oiled ceramite and new paint. Grey hunters checked and rechecked bolters, chainswords, and frostblades, their movements those of men who had performed the same rituals for centuries. Long Fangs stood silent and grim over racks of heavy weapons, lips moving in the old prayers taught by sergeants long turned to dust. Wolfguard, veterans donned their warplate. Terminator suits ancient when the rift tore open were locked and sealed by rune priests and iron priests working in concert. Hexagrammic wards flared faintly green across thick ceramite plates, shivering as echoes of the new warp presence washed over them. Men who had stood at Russ's side before his disappearance, their faces crisscrossed with scars, older than most of the Imperium's current rulers, flexed gauntleted hands and felt the weight of their weapons settle into familiar grooves. The Wulfen howled. They were held deep below the Fang, in caverns whose walls were carved with binding runes, and whose gates were wrought from adamantium and faith. Hexagrammic chains clinked as the warped sons of Fenris hurled themselves against them, claws scratching at unyielding metal, muzzles snapping on empty air. Their howls rose and fell in waves, answering the roar of the warp-born skull in the sky with their own unfettered hunger. Every warrior who could stand, every weapon that could fire, every drop of blood that could be spilled for the world, and the saga was made ready. Above, the Void War began. Imperial Navy picket ships died first, their hulls torn open by long-range lances and barrages of hell-forged ordnance. Where their reactors went critical, brief suns blossomed in the dark, only to be snuffed out by the shadow of the onrushing enemy. Cruisers moved up to meet the Black Legion spearheads, torpedoes streaking from their tubes, macro cannons vomiting shells the size of hab blocks. The void turned into a meat grinder. An Imperial cruiser, proud and old, her prow emblazoned with a wolf's head, took a broadside from a hell-forged battleship and staggered. Armor plating peeled back like flayed skin. Atmosphere roared out in a storm of vapor and bodies. Hundreds of serfs, gunners, armsmen and officers were ripped from their posts, their last screams torn from their mouths as the cold claimed them, freezing their blood into fragile crystals. Captain and bridge crew refused to die sitting down. With a last ragged order, the cruiser rammed her attacker. Engines flared to white. Thrusters burned out, turning to slag under the strain. The battered vessel drove herself forward like a thrown blade, void shield spent, hull groaning. She struck the battleship amidships. The impact turned steel and flesh and demon metal into a single shrieking mass. Hulls crumpled, gun decks folded, warp-spawned creatures shrieked as holy machine spirit and unholy animus tore at one another in mutual hatred. The two ships locked together, burning, and drifted toward the gravity well of Fenris's star, leaving a wake of wreckage and frozen dead. Elsewhere, torpedoes found their marks. Warheads punched into the flanks of enemy vessels, boring through plate and pumping tubes before detonating. Hive-sized macro cannon fell silent as their magazines cooked off, blooming into clouds of shrapnel that shredded anything unlucky enough to be nearby. Boarding torpedoes slammed home, their adamantine beaks cutting into enemy hulls, disgorging armored boarding parties into corridors already full of smoke and blood. Every victory cost lives by the thousand. Every loss cost more. The war did not restrict itself to the void. On the mining moon of Kraka-Dreng, the ground trembled under the passage of an armored tide. The moon had been a scarred rock even before the war, its surface riddled with mine heads and extraction pits, its thin atmosphere barely clinging to life. Now it was a charnel ground. 10,000 Leman Russ battle tanks rolled across the tortured regolith, their tracks grinding bodies into a pulp of bone and armor fragments. Baneblades and other Lord of War chassis strode among them, their heavy turrets rotating in ponderous arcs to track fresh targets. Behind them, lines of artillery crawled forward like steel centipedes, their barrels moving through prescribed patterns as they hurled. Shell after shell into the distance. Cultists swarmed to meet them. They came in their millions, a tide of filthy bodies and ragged uniforms, weapons ranging from stolen laser guns to rusted knives. Their skin was daubed in blood and sigils, some still recognizable as once human, others bulging with mutations that glistened wetly. They charged across fields already ankle-deep in corpses, clambering over the dead of earlier waves, as if those bodies were no more than rough terrain. The tanks opened fire. Battle cannons roared, sending shells screaming into the massed ranks. Explosions plowed furrows through the cultists, hurling bodies into the air in sprays of limbs and viscera. Demolisher cannons fired point blank, collapsing bunkers and trench lines that had been hastily carved into slag and meat. Sponson heavy bolters chewed, their streams of fire stitching lines of ruptured flesh through the tide. Corrupted guardsmen took up firing positions further back, their once crisp uniforms now stained and torn, their insignia cut into their own skin. They fired in disciplined volleys, Lars beams lancing into the Imperial lines, punching holes in infantry screens, chewing at exposed sensor masts and track guards. Their commanders bellowed orders that were half drill and half blasphemy, their voices rising above the thunder of battle. The heretic tide swelled. For every million cut down under battle cannon shells and heavy bolter fire, another million poured from the mineheads and collapsed hab structures. They clambered over wrecked tanks, over burning corpses, over each other. Those struck by stray warp motes from the crimson skull above warped as they ran, limbs elongating, jaws splitting, eyes multiplying across their faces, but still they came on. Kraka Dreng became a machine for turning flesh into slurry. In the skies above it, the Chaos Fleet and the Imperial Relief Armadas fought over who would own the ruin. On Fenris, Logan Grimnar prepared his world to die. He stood upon a fortress wall of the Fang, the storm clawing at him. The air up there was knife cold, the wind coming straight from the distant ice floes with nothing to break its force. The crimson skull above leered down, its empty eye sockets burning. Grimnar's Terminator armor hummed, its ancient servos working to keep his massive frame stable as he looked down at the assembled host. Ranks upon ranks of space wolves stood in the courtyard below, shoulder to shoulder, plate to plate. The russet-haired fury of blood claws, the scarred calm of grey hunters, the forbidding bulk of Wolfguard in tactical dreadnought armor. Banners snapped, each one bearing the saga glyphs of a great company, their edges already tattered by the unnatural wind. Among them stood mortal warriors, Fenrisian tribesmen holding heavy axes and battered laser guns, Imperial Guard regiments drawn from other worlds, their uniforms a riot of colors and patterns. Wolfen howls echoed faintly from the depths below, a constant undertone to the wind. Grimnar's voice cut through it all. "If this is the wolf time," he thundered, his words carried and magnified by Vox and the throat-deep growl that had commanded wolves and men for longer than many worlds had existed. "Then let the galaxy hear how a wolf dies." Silence held for a heartbeat, a held breath stretched across the courtyard. Then the howl came. It tore itself from 1,000 throats, from 1,000 more, until it was no longer individual voices but a single sound, a weapon forged from faith and fury. Astartes in their ceramite shells, mortals in flak and fur, all threw back their heads and howled at the skull in the sky. The sound rattled the stones of the Fang, set frost to dancing on parapets, echoed back from the distant mountains. The crimson skull did not answer, but something in its burning eyes seemed to narrow, as if in sudden attention. News came like a breath of colder air through the war councils. Astropathic fragments, borne on tortured currents, reached the Fang's choir pits. They spoke of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Robuta Gilliman, turning a significant portion of his crusade's strength toward the Fenris system. Entire chapters of Primaris Astartes, fleets of sleek, new-forged escort vessels, and ancient battle barges, Mechanicus supply trains laden with war machines, all redirected into the path of the approaching storm. It was not salvation. It was a promise of further blood. "The Regent sends his best," one Wolf Lord said, lip curling as he rolled a carved bone between his fingers. "Shiny new suns in shiny new plate. We will see how they fare where the ice bites." "Do not sneer," Grimnar replied, more tired than angry. "Fresh flesh is still flesh. We will need every blade, old or new." "Will they arrive in time?" another asked. The question hung heavy. The great rift writhed between Gilliman's mustering zones and Fenris like a living thing. Warp storms bucked. Navigators went blind in their towers, their third eyes burned out by the strain of trying to steer fleets through currents that shifted with every heartbeat. Ships were lost in translation, their names scratched off rolls and consigned to the long, growing lists of the missing. Gilliman's arm did reach toward Fenris, but whether it would clash fists with the Black Legion or close upon ashes remained beyond mortal prediction. Logan Grimnar did not count on rescue. He counted on teeth and steel and the stubbornness of his world. On the highest peak of the Fang, above even the point where Grimnar had stood to listen to the World Wolves, Njaal's Stormcaller and the Rune Priests drew blood on ice. The wind up there was a living thing. It came at them in gusts that could have flayed skin from bone. The sky was close, the crimson skull looming vast and oppressive. The ice underfoot was old, layers upon layers of winters pressed into a single hard surface, shot through with the ghosts of past sacrifices. Demon hosts were dragged to the circle. They were wretched things, their flesh distended by possession, their mouths full of teeth that did not fit, their eyes weeping black ichor. Chains rattled as they were forced to their knees, their bodies writhing as the entities within them reacted to the warding runes carved into the circle's boundary. Rune priests moved among them, chanting in low, harsh cadences, voices threading through the wind. Traitor psychers followed. Some came bound in barbed wire and penitence engines, their mouths sewn shut, their hands removed. Others still looked almost human, save for the madness in their eyes and the faint shimmer of warp light around their fingers. All had been taken in earlier battles, dragged back to the Fang, not for interrogation, but for this moment. Niall stood at the center, staff in one hand, knife in the other. The blade was old, its edge chipped but still sharp, its grip worn smooth by centuries of use. Runes ran along its length, each one a name, a storm, a promise. He raised it, speaking in a tongue older than the High Gothic of the Administratum, older than the Low Gothic of the Guard. It was the language of Fenris before the Imperium, before the Allfather, before the legions had come. He cut. Throats opened under the knife, human and inhuman alike. Blood spilled out, steaming in the icy air, thicker and darker where warp taint had permeated it. It ran where the rune priests directed it, along channels carved into the ice, forming patterns too complex for any mortal mind to have conceived unaided. The blood froze as it flowed, not in the way of simple cold, but in shapes dictated by will and rune, lines and curves, intersecting paths, spirals that seemed to turn inward forever. Each new sacrifice added a layer, a depth, a nuance to the frozen lattice. The circle became a web, a trap, a beacon. Inyal felt the warp's attention turn. He ignored. The pressure that pushed at his mind, the whispering voices that rose from the bleeding sky. He fixed his thoughts on one figure, a giant in battered warplate, a wolf at his heart and a spear in his hand, striding through storms that would have shattered lesser beings. "Leman Russ," he roared, his voice cracking with the force of it. "Wolf King, Lord of Winter and War, we call you. Your world burns, your sons bleed. The wolf time is upon us. The saga is not done." Lightning slammed into the peak. It did not come from the skull above, but from somewhere else, somewhere sideways to reality. It struck the frozen rune lattice dead center, exploding outward in a pattern that matched the bloodlines exactly. For a heartbeat, the ice became glass, transparent and full of stars. Then it shattered into a storm of shards that rose instead of fell, drawn upward into the churning sky. The Chaos Armada chose that moment to loose a killing blow. From Black Legion battleships and their attendant monsters, lances of raw energy stabbed downward. Planet-breaker shells, the kind of ordnance normally reserved for the annihilation of worlds that had defied the Imperium beyond forgiveness, fell toward Fenris. In the void, ordnance racks emptied in a single murderous salvo. The Fang's void shield screamed. Energy flared around the fortress monastery, fields flickering under the impact of that wrath. Fenris' thin atmosphere boiled where the beams struck it, aurorae of unnatural color writhing. The ground shook as near misses gouged craters out of the ice, sending tsunamis of shattered flow rolling across the seas. Then a new storm erupted in the system's heart. It was not the wild, tumorous growth of a chaos warp breach. It was colder, sharper, its boundaries marked not by random flares of empiric nonsense, but by lines of runes that glowed in a hard, ice-blue light. It flowered like a wolf's head, carved from the bones of reality itself, jaws opening to scream. A gale into the void. Every wolf on Fenris felt it, from the highest parapet of the Fang to the deepest ice caverns, from the most battle-scarred wolf guard to the youngest bloodclaw, from the wolfen gnawing at their chains to the world wolves pacing the ice floes. They all threw back their heads and howled. The sound roared out, smashing aside fear and doubt, cutting through the thunder of bombardment, racing up into the new storm. Something answered. Shapes emerged from the cold light. They were void ships, but not as any sane chart or listing would have them. Strike cruisers and escorts bearing the ancient wolf-head sigil of the pre-heresy legion slid into real space, their hulls scarred and twisted. Demon bone clung to their flanks like barnacles. Burned rune wards carved over the scars where it had been torn out. Their prows were crowned with trophies, the frozen heads of demon princes, the shattered helms of traitor lords, the twisted remnants of alien monstrosities. They came with the howling of souls. Warp wraiths, lashed to their hulls, screamed as real space burned them away. The echoes of slain demons clung to their gun decks and launch bays, hissing in frustration at being denied fresh kills. Vox projectors bled a low, continuous growl across all channels, a sound that sent mortal ratings to their knees and set Astartes' teeth on edge. At the head of that pack of shattered Baroque hunters, one silhouette moved. It was a warship older than the Rift, older than Gilliman's Book of War, a relic from the days when the Allfather's dream had still been taking shape. Its prow was carved into the snarling visage of a Fenrisian wolf, its eyes burning with a light that was not entirely mechanical. At its tip, on a jutting platform wreathed in azure flame, a single, monstrous figure stood. Armor ragged, cloak in tatters, hair whipped by the storm of translation, he held a spear that burned like a shard of a dead star. Logan Grimnar, standing, once more upon the summit of the Fang, felt something in his chest unclench. "The Wolf King," he whispered, as below him the howls rose higher. "He has come home." The Hrafnkel came howling out of the storm. She drove before her, a bow wave of frost that was not water and light that was not light, ripping the warp's chill from her flanks as she slammed fully into real space. Her hull was an old shape, from an age when the Allfather's dream had still been a rising sun instead of a guttering ember. The lines of her prows spoke of the Great Crusade, of the wolves of Fenris running at the forefront of a fleet that had once believed it could tame the stars. Time and the eye had not left her unchanged. Demonic bone crusted her armor like barnacles on a long-drowned carcass. Fused skulls of things that had never known mortality leered from between adamantium plates, their eye sockets empty, their mouths locked in eternal screams that now produced no sound. Where such corruption had been torn away, the scars were raw grooves in the metal, rune wards hammered over them in layers, glowing cold blue in the void. Along her keel and around her vox arrays, great horns had been worked into the hull. They were not decorative. They were mouths for a sound that had become as much a weapon as any lance or torpedo. The Hrafnkel howled. It rolled out across the system, a lupine roar translated into hard radiation and vox distortion. It made mortal ratings fall to their knees on decks of friendly ships, hands clamped over bleeding ears. It made Auspex screens crackle with ghost runes. It made lesser demons bound into the hulls of Black Legion vessels thrash and shriek, snapping chains, clawing at their own wards in desperate attempts to get away from a sound that spoke to them in terms they did not understand and could not endure. Around the Hrafnkel, her sister ships surged. The Icefang, the Grey Widow, vessels thought lost since the age when brothers had murdered brothers under the hollow eyes of their gene-sire. Other hulls without recorded names but heavy with history, each bearing the old wolf-head sigil, each scarred and baroque, each trailing screams of dead warp entities like ragged banners. Their engines burned cold and bright, pushing them straight toward the heart of the enemy armada. The Black Legion moved to intercept. Their grand cruisers altered course, lines of firepower swinging to present broadsides. Escorts slid into flanking positions, attack craft launch bays beginning to cycle. Holds full of warped boarding parties woke to the sound of klaxons, the laughter of demons, and the barked orders of traitor captains. Void shields thickened around the spearheads of the traitor flotilla, an invisible wall raised against the onrushing relics. On the bridge of the Hrafnkel, Leman Russ bared his teeth. The Wolf King stood at the forward transteal, where most admirals would never dare to place themselves. There were no hololithic displays before him, no layered tactica screens. The void itself was his chart, the enemy's formation, a picture he understood at a glance. His cloak hung from his broad shoulders in ragged strips, still rimed with the frost of the eye. His armor was a patchwork of Fenrisian grey and demon bone, battered but thrumming with power. The spear in his fist pulsed in time with the beating of his twin hearts. "Raise shields," an iron priest began, voice crackling from a half-metal throat. Russ shook his head once. "No," he said. "Teeth first." Orders rippled out from his words, as if they were a command to the ship's machine spirit itself. Instead of void shields flaring, boarding torpedo tubes cycled open along the flanks of the wolf ships. Adamantine beaks slid into place, rune-etched casings locking with the finality of a foregone kill. Racks upon racks of armored cylinders, loaded with warriors and breaching charges, and rage slid into firing positions. In the holds, the pack howled. Warp-scarred space wolves battered at the inside of their harnesses, their armor clanking. Wolfen snapped and clawed, held barely in check by restraint fields and the sheer bulk of ceramite walls. Jarl captains checked seals, slammed fists into chest plates, invoked Russ's name and that of the Allfather, invoked the sagas, invoked nothing but the thrill of imminent bloodshed. The Hrafnkel bellowed another howl. Then she and her sisters opened their jaws. Boarding torpedoes spat from their flanks in a storm. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became hundreds of thousands. A swarm of man-sized meteors trailing warfire as they crossed the void. Point defense guns on the Black Legion ships came alive, spitting flak and energy into the oncoming storm, shredding some, detonating others prematurely. It did not matter. There were always more. Torpedoes slammed into traitor hulls. Adamantium beaks crunched through outer plating, compressing themselves. Forward, until internal triggers hit their marks. Melter charges went off in blinding flares of thermal annihilation, blasting ragged mouths into the sides of ships that had called themselves invincible. Bulkheads twisted. Atmosphere screamed out. Flesh tore. From those wounds, the wolves poured in. In the corridors of a Black Legion Grand Cruiser named for some forgotten victory, alarms howled. Traitor Marines in black and gold eyes turned toward the sound of tearing metal. Gangers and cultists skidded to halts mid-patrol, eyes going wide. Lesser demons that had been slumbering like ticks in the walls woke to the smell of fresh souls. The first boarding torpedo punched through. Its nose cone blew apart, plating bending outward like flower petals. Smoke and pressure poured out. For a heartbeat, there was only a howling gale. Then, a space wolf burst from the breach, his armor scorched, his eyes burning. He hit the nearest traitor like a meteor. Chainswords screamed, bolt pistols barked. Wolfen hurled themselves out behind their brothers, pale fur bristling, claws dragging sparks from deck plating. The corridors filled with the sound of ripping flesh and cracking ceramite, with bellowed Fenrisian oaths and the wet shriek of dying mortals and immortals alike. Across the battlefield of the void, it was the same. Imperial decks became killing grounds. Some torpedoes struck and were repulsed or destroyed, their cargo vented into nothing, their death howls lost in the roar of engines. Enough survived. Enough slammed home and opened, disgorging millions of warriors into the arteries of the traitor fleet. Void War became a brawl. On one of the Black Legion Grand Cruisers, forming the enemy line's spine, the carnage focused itself into a single, widening wound. Leman Russ led from the front. His boarding torpedo struck just below the enemy ship's primary gunnery decks. It hit harder than mass and velocity alone could explain, as if the disdain of the wolf king added its own weight. When it blew, the breach it left behind was large enough for 3 dreadnoughts to pass side by side. Russ was the first through. He came in a rush of smoke and pressure, boots ringing on the deck as he landed. The air in the corridor was already alive with fire and debris, alarms screeching, lights strobing madly. Traitor Astartes were there to meet him, their black and brass armor glimmering in the emergency glow, their eyes burning behind horned helms. They raised their bolters. Russ raised his spear. He did not bother with words. The first volley struck him, explosive rounds hammering into rune-warded plate, detonating in gouts of fire and shrapnel. Fragments howled away in all directions. Several embedded themselves in his skin and armor. They did not slow him in the slightest. He moved. The spear of Russ scythed out in an arc, trailing a cold shimmer. The front rank of Black Legionnaires came apart. Armor parted like flayed hide. Ceramite and bone and flesh separated in clean, obscene layers. The halves of bodies slamming into walls and floor. Blood and black ichor spraying in sheets that steamed as they hit still-hot metal. One traitor's helm and shoulders stayed where they were while the rest of him slid downward in a slow, inevitable collapse. Terminators stepped up from behind them, hulking figures in tactical dreadnought plate, armed with chain fists and heavy combi bolters. They were killers of killers, men whose entire long lives had been honed into the art of breaking other Astartes. They advanced in a disciplined line, weapons raised, their armor humming, their heavy footsteps shaking the deck. Russ hit them like a thunderhead. He drove the spear point through the breastplate of the first, pinning the Terminator to the bulkhead behind him with such force that his massive body buckled around the haft. The Wolf King let go of the weapon for a heartbeat, closing the distance to the next opponent with empty hands. He caught the second Terminator's chain fist as it swung toward him, fingers closing around the whirring teeth. Metal shrieked. Sparks flew. The chain fist screamed and died as he crushed the mechanism, gears snapping. With his other hand, he punched forward, his gauntlet slamming into the traitor's chest. There was a sound like a fault line breaking. Ceramite and adamantium cracked. The Black Legionnaire's breastplate imploded, his ribcage folding inward, his primary heart bursting like overripe fruit. Russ tore his hand free, dragging a stringer of bone and meat with it. The third Terminator tried to bring his combi bolter up. Russ stepped in, moving with the speed of a predator far younger than his 10,000 years. His hand shot out, fingers plunging into the gap at the base of the traitor's helmet, where gorget and collar met. His grip closed on spine. He pulled. The traitor's body convulsed. Vertebrae snapped one after another, a cascade of popping. Cartilage and grinding bone. Russ ripped the entire spine free, in a long, wet chain, chunks of still-twitching nerve tissue and shreds of muscle hanging from it. The traitor's body dropped, armor clattering, blood pumping from the ruin of his neck. Russ swung the stolen spine like a flail. He smashed it into the face of another Terminator, the vertebrae cracking against ceramite with meaty, concussive blows, leaving smears of brain and skull on the armor. The Terminator reeled, stunned. Russ stepped in and stamped down, his boot crushing the traitor's knee, splintering bone and joint. As the huge warrior fell, Russ wrenched his spear from the wall and rammed it through the falling body, pinning it to the deck. The corridor became a butcher's trench. Space wolves flooded in around him, howling, firing, hacking. Wolfen vaulted over fallen bulkheads and shattered armor, their claws raking deep gouges into deck plating as they chased retreating traitors. Blood sprayed in arcs that painted sigils over the walls, sigils that stared back at the demons bound there and made them shrink away in something like fear. At the heart of the Grand Cruiser, in a chamber lined with trophies taken from 100 fallen worlds, the Chaos Lord waited. He was a towering figure in Baroque plate, horns curling from his helm, black cloak hanging heavy with chains and skulls. His power sword burned with a baleful light. The mark of the 8-pointed star glowed upon his breastplate, a brand of allegiance to a pantheon of things that had no rightful worship. Around him stood his chosen Terminators and Champions, the elite of his warband. Corpses of serfs and lesser warriors lay scattered across the black marble floor, their blood running in thin streams toward a central dais. The doors did not open. They blew inward, torn from their recesses, and hurled into the chamber as twisted, spinning slabs. Leman Russ walked through the dust. Blood dripped from his armor, much of it not his own. His cloak was a ragged shadow behind him. His spear trailed that strange, molten soul stuff, each drop hissing as it hit the stone, burning tiny pits in the polished surface. "Which of you presumes to own this ship?" he asked, voice carrying easily over the crackle of warp energies and the distant, dull thunder of explosions. The Chaos Lord stepped forward, drawing himself up, his presence turned up like a weapon. The air around him seethed with unseen entities. His chosen tightened their grips on their weapons, armor servos whirring. "I am Lord Karzath of the Black Legion," he snarled, "breaker of the Gilded Gate, bane of the—" Russ did not bother to listen. He moved faster than any mortal eye could follow. One moment, he stood across the room. The next, he was within reach, his spear lashing out. Karzath parried the first thrust by instinct alone, his power sword sparking as it intercepted the blade. The impact jarred his arm to the shoulder, threatening to dislocate it even through his armor's servos. He countercut, his sword angling for Russ's throat. The Wolf King stepped inside the swing. He drove a mailed fist into the traitor's faceplate. The helm dented, ceramite cracked. Karzath staggered, his vision full of sparks. Russ followed up with a knee that smashed into his gut, crushing plate, driving the breath from him. The Chaos Lord tried to speak a curse, to call upon the favor of the dark pantheon that had sustained him for so long. Russ swatted his sword away and impaled him. The spear punched through black and brass, through flesh long poisoned by warp energies, through fused bone and scar tissue. It pinned Karzath to the back wall, lifting him clear of the ground. His limbs spasmed, armor scraping at the stone. His mouth worked behind his cracked helm, drool and blood running down his chin. Russ stepped closer until their helms were almost touching. "You broke gates," he said softly. "I break kings." With a contemptuous twist, he tore the spear free. Karzath's bisected body slid down the wall, leaving a smear of ichor that hissed and writhed before fading. The gods he had served did not come to claim him. They were busy elsewhere. His chosen died around him, cut down by the 13th and their wolfen kin in a storm of chain-blade teeth and frost axes. Later, on the Hrafnkel's prow, a different kind of ceremony played out. The captured sorcerer knelt in chains of black iron, his armor stripped, his flesh crawling with tattooed sigils that wavered and tried to peel themselves from his skin. His hands were bound behind him, his head forced back by a fist tangled in his hair. Warp fire smoldered in the depths of his eyes, flickering weakly, as if the presence that had once filled him had retreated in anticipation of what was coming. "Mercy," he croaked, violet-tinged blood oozing from the corner of his mouth. "Great One, Wolf King, spare me and I speak truths. I will show you pathways through the storms that even your navigators do not know. I will offer you names of princes and dukes in the eye. I will—" Russ crouched in front of him. Up close, the Primarch's presence was a crushing thing, heavier than any gravity well. The sorcerer's words dried up in his throat as those pale, lupine eyes fixed on him. "You think I am bargaining," Russ said mildly. "You think these are days when mercy is coined to buy meat." He nodded to one of his jarls. "Take his fangs," he said. "A sorcerer without his tongue can still be of use, but a sorcerer without his fangs is less likely to bite when nailed to wood." They held the traitor down as he screamed. Pliers clamped onto elongated canines, twisted, tore. Blood ran down his chin, splattering the deck in dark arcs. He bucked and thrashed, warp fire flaring around him, but the runes carved into the prow drank it in, leaving him powerless. When it was done, Russ rose. "Put him there," he said, pointing to the jutting iron spar at the very tip of the Hrafunkel's prow, beneath the carved wolf's head. "Facing forward, I want him to see every world we save, and every world we fail to save, all the way until he freezes solid. Call it an offering to whatever passes for justice in this age." They nailed the sorcerer up, his hands spread, his arms pinned, his legs bound. Spikes punched through bone and wood, through metal and flesh. He shrieked until his voice broke, then kept making sounds long after that, thin, breathy things that might have been curses, or prayers, or both. Void frost began to gather along his lashes, on his lips, in his bloody mouth. The Hrafunkel howled again. This time the sound was not quite laughter, but it was close. Across the system, Vox channels crackled, static hissed, Auspex screens flickered. For a heartbeat, it seemed that the warp itself might be trying to smother what was about to be said. Then, Leman Russ's voice rolled across the void. "Sons of Fenris," he said. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They were delivered in a level rumble, rich with old smoke and older battlefields, carried on encrypted frequencies, on astropathic echoes, on the backs of the very howls his ships had been pouring into the warp. They reached every ship that carried a fragment of his gene line, every warrior who had ever called the Fang home, every mind that had ever dreamt of wolves running across starlight. "You have howled long enough without your king," Russ continued. "Now we hunt." For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the reply came. On bridge decks and in engine rooms, in trenches and in the bellies of dropships, in the Fang's halls and the caves below, wolves howled. Space wolves clenched fists and slammed them against breastplates, their voices rising in wordless roars that shook Vox pickups to screaming. Fenrisian tribesmen howled with them, their rough throats carrying the sound into the rafters. Even some mortal officers of other regiments found themselves joining in, the sound ripping itself from their throats without conscious thought. Billions of guardsmen, hearing only fragments, roared and beat their weapons together, sensing some change in the tenor of the war. Imperial commanders, presented with the impossible reality of a Primarch returned and leading from the front, did what men bred to war do when presented with a chance to turn the tide. They attacked. Orders changed in midstream. Defense plans, carefully wrought to eke out survival over measured spans of time, were ripped up or amended on the fly. Artillery that had been hoarding shells for final stands opened up in rolling barrages. Trench lines disgorged their occupants, men and armor surging forward into no man's land with a fury that surprised even their own officers. Commissars tried to keep up, their pistols and power swords raised, their voices barking litanies and threats and praises of the Emperor. They were left behind in some sectors, as the rank and file outpaced them, driven on not by fear of punishment, but by a rare, raw hope, and the berserker relief of being allowed to charge instead of huddle and die. The void lit up with new assaults. Imperial cruisers that had been locked into grinding duels with Chaos ships threw themselves bodily at their foes, ramming, boarding, forcing engagements where the wolves' newly arrived packs could lend their feral weight. Titan legios on nearby moons pushed their engines into the red, striding into fire patterns that had previously been deemed too risky, laying down curtains of destruction to clear approaches for counterattacks. Above Fenris, the skies blazed. Drop pods fell like a meteor storm, streaking burning trails through the thin atmosphere. Their ceramite shells glowed red, then white, as they punched through layers of warp-tainted cloud, shedding fire as they came. The sound of their descent was like the drumming of some vast mechanical heart. They slammed into demon-infested tundra, into the shattered ruins of orbital habs that had crashed to the surface, into fortifications built by cultists. In the brief window, they had thought themselves victorious. Impact retros fired, hatches blew outward in bursts of steam and smoke. Chainswords roared, frost blades glittered, entire great companies descended as falling stars. Where their pods struck, the battle changed. Space wolves tore into demon packs and traitor platoons alike, their bolters vomiting explosive death, their axes and claws making mockery of armor and unnatural flesh. Laughter and howls mingled with the screams. Rune priests strode among them, hurling lightning drawn from the storm into the ranks of the enemy, calling down spears of ice that impaled greater demons and pinned them to the tundra. On a blasted plain, not far from the base of the Fang, another pod hit. Its doors blew outward. Frost smoke billowed. Leman Russ stepped onto the ice of Fenris for the first time in 10,000 years. He paused for a heartbeat, boots crunching on snow and frozen spattered blood. The air hit him like an old friend, full of salt from the distant seas, of iron from the rocks, of smoke from the Fang's forges and feasting halls. Beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the musk of world wolves and wild Fenrisian beasts. He smiled. Logan Grimnar approached through the swirling smoke, his own Terminator armor throwing back the light of the burning sky. Njal walked at his side, staff tapping on the ice, runes smoldering faintly. Ragnar Blackmane was there as well, his mane of hair bound back in rough braids, his armor still spattered with the ichor of recent kills. Behind them stood ranks of space wolves and their Primaris kin. The latter stood out even among giants, taller, broader, their war plates subtly different, marked with fresh-cut runes and heraldry that had not been seen in the days before Russ vanished into the eye. They bore his gene seed, the wolf in their blood unmistakable, but their eyes had never seen him except as an image in sagas, a figure of legend. For a moment, nobody spoke. The storm roared overhead. The crimson skull glowered. The ice creaked. Russ broke the silence with a low chuckle. "You grew old, Logan," he said in Fenrisian, his voice carrying easily over the gale. "You took your time, Lord," Grimnar answered, something like a grin twisting his own bearded face. "We have been keeping the sagas going without you." Russ's gaze passed over him, over Njal with his rune staff and his storm-scarred eyes, over Ragnar with his hungry grin and his chip-toothed wolf icons. Then it settled on the Primaris. They stood at attention, helms locked to their belts or worn and open, eyes fixed on the figure they had trained their entire lives to honor. The wind tugged at their wolf tails and banners. Some bore scars already, some did not. All stood a fraction straighter under that lupine gaze. "What are these?" Russ asked, no softness in his tone. "Half-grown pups in borrowed skins." "Primaris," Ragnar answered, his voice edged. "New forged in the Regent's Wars. They bleed like any of us. They have died for Fenris, for you, though you were not here to see it." Russ's eyes flicked to him. "You bare your fangs quickly for a young Jarl," he said. "The galaxy has changed," Ragnar snarled. "You left it with brothers at your side, and a dream, however cracked. You returned to suns going out and worlds torn open. We have had to learn new ways to kill, just to keep from being drowned." Russ laughed then, a rolling, rough sound that somehow cut through the wind and the distant thunder of guns. "The galaxy always changes," he said. "War does not. It is the same beast it has always been. Teeth in the dark, blood on the snow. The only question is whether we are the hunters or the meat." He looked back at the Primaris once more, eyes narrowing, then nodded once, as if making a private peace. "If they can run, if they can bite, if they can die well," he said, "then they are wolves. That is all that matters." Later, with the immediate greetings spoken and the necessities of war dragging at their sleeves, they mustered. On a wide plain of ice within sight of the Fang, a host gathered that had not been seen since the days of the Great Crusade. Tens of thousands of space wolves stood in ordered disorder, a formation that looked like a riot, but moved like a single beast. Armor trailed wolf tails and sagas, picked out in runes. Helms were carved to suggest snarling muzzles. Banners snapped, carrying the glyphs of great companies and kill marks from campaigns stretching back over millennia. Around them, in ranks that stretched to the horizon, stood millions of mortal warriors, Fenrisian tribesmen with axes and laser guns. Astra Militarum, in uniforms from 100 worlds, mantles and greatcoats and flak vests forming a patchwork. Skitari cohorts with their gleaming limbs and impassive red optics. Nightwalkers stood at the edges, towering above the mass. Chainswords and thermal lances held ready. Titans loomed further back still, their god machine silhouettes stark against the burning sky. Leman Russ walked to the center. He did not mount a dais. He did not need to. The crowd parted before him, wolves and men alike stepping back, leaving a clear space of scarred ice. He planted the butt of his spear there with a crack that seemed to echo up through the world's bones. The gale slackened for a heartbeat, as if listening. "I am Leman Russ," he said. The name rolled across the assembly like a physical force. Men shivered, wolves straightened. Even the titans seemed to lean in, their machine spirits pricking up incorporeal ears. "I am the Wolf King, the Lord of Winter and War, the All-Father's Butcher, the breaker of oaths and kings. I left this world when the sky first tore, and the sons of the Emperor turned their hands against each other. I have hunted ever since, through halls of demons and over fields of frozen souls, until the Eye itself grew tired of trying to kill me." He lifted the spear. "We stand at the wolf time," he went on, voice hard as the ice beneath his feet. "The galaxy burns. The foes of mankind grow fat on our weakness. They think the old tales ended when I walked into the storm. They think the wolves are tired and the pack scattered. They think this world is meat." He drove the spear deeper into the ice. Cracks spidered out from the point of impact, thin black lines that spread and spread, as if the very world were answering. "I swear this," Russ said, every word a prophecy. "I will not leave this system while a single enemy warship still burns its engines in our sky. I will not rest while one traitor boot stands upon our ice. We will run them down. We will tear their ships from the void. We will break their gods upon this world's teeth. The ice of Fenris will drink their blood until even the warp remembers what it is to be prey." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the howling began again. It rose from wolf and man alike, from throats of flesh, and from vox speakers built into towering engines, from the hearts of a people who had been waiting too long for this moment. It rolled out across the plain, across the seas, across the mountains, up into the torn sky where the crimson skull leered. For the first time, something in that skull seemed to draw back. Above, the Hrafunkel and her sisters turned their prows toward the enemy fleet. Below, on ice and in trenches, and in the shadow of god machines, warriors tightened their grips on weapons and felt their fear burn away, replaced by something older and fiercer. The Wolf King had returned. The hunt was on. Fenris became the axle on which an entire sector's death spun. When the Wolf King planted his spear in the ice and called the hunt, the war did not remain bound to the world beneath the crimson skull. It spilled outward, along warp lanes and old trade routes, across subsector boundaries, and into regions that had once been footnotes on administratum charts. The scent of blood on Fenris drew predators from every quarter. The Black Legion tightened its grip, hurling fresh warbands and demon hosts into the system, determined to grind the wolves and their resurrected sire into the ice. Other traitor legions clustered around them, drawn by the promise of killing a Primarch or dying in the attempt. Sorcerer fleets traced hateful sigils in the void, their rituals turning neighboring stars into fonts of madness. Xenos opportunists cut at the fat edges. Orc empires vomited forth green tides and rusted hulks, roaring with glee at the scale of the fighting. Drukhari raiding barges rode the dark currents, darting into, snatch screaming captives from both sides. Rogue Aeldari corsairs and long-fallen craft world remnants stalked the fringes, striking at what they deemed necessary for their own impenetrable dances of fate. Imperial lords rebelled. Planetary governors who had balanced their fear of the Inquisition against their fear of the warp now gambled that the galaxy's fracture gave them room to grasp crowns. Some declared for the arch-traitor, their palaces becoming fortresses crowned in 8-pointed stars. Others turned inward, sealing their systems, refusing tithes, trying to ride out the storm behind walls of ignorance. Dozens of worlds burned at once. On shrine planets, pilgrim seas turned to slaughter grounds as demons walked down processional avenues and bathed in the blood of the faithful. On forge moons, manufactoria the size of cities were gutted by civil war. Servitor armies turned upon their masters, titans striding through their own assembly yards with guns blazing. Every conflict was counted not in regiments or divisions, but in numbers of the dead that had to be expressed in layers of zeros just to fit in a cogitator's memory. At the center of it all, Fenris howled and bled. Demonic legions and traitor Astartes threw themselves against the world with a persistence that bordered on madness. Waves of warp spawn poured down from the Crimson Skull, their forms flickering and shifting under the pressure of their own unreality, claws and blade limbs ripping trenches in the ice as they hit. Warbands of Chaos Marines in black and brass, or in the hateful colors of long-fallen legions, dropped in howling drop-pods and hell talons, their war cries blasphemies shouted against the storm. The Fang became a mountain of guns and corpses. Void shields flickered and flared as lance strikes clawed at its adamantium sheathing. Defense lasers burned continuous lines of fire into incoming vessels, reducing some to falling slag that lit the sky and turned others aside in wounded spirals. Bastions along its flanks spat Stormbolter and Lascanon fire, carving craters into demon tides that surged up the slopes. Where the fortifications were breached, where the tide pressed too hard, there the Wolf King himself went. Leman Russ led countercharges that shattered realities. He hurled himself into the thickest fighting, his spear a line of white death that tore demons apart wholesale, reducing them to clouds of shrieking vapor that were sucked back into the warp. Traitor Astartes, who had boasted of having killed loyalist Primarchs in the heresy, found their chests opened with contemptuous ease, their secondary hearts pulped under mailed fists, their bodies used as battering rams to knock their brothers from ledges. His presence turned every melee into a massacre. Where the line had begun to bow, where guardsmen's hands had started to slip on their bayonets, and even space wolves had to brace against the press, Russ appeared like a throne, bolder. He broke the enemy's momentum by sheer force of will and slaughter. Piles of hacked-apart traitors and demon carcasses grew wherever he passed, their twisted forms dragged into place by exhausted wolves to form improvised ramparts slick with ichor and human blood. Even so, not all who fought for Fenris under his eye met his standard. On the third day of the siege's hardest push, on a flank where the Fang's outer bastions overlooked a frozen bay, a regiment of Astra Militarum broke. They were not cowards by the measure of men. They had already stood through bombardment that had turned their forward trenches into vapor and bone. They had repulsed 3 assaults by cultist hordes, flooding the ice with bodies until their boots could find no footing that was not someone's corpse. They had already watched their officers and their priests torn limb from limb by demons whose names they would never know. When the next wave came, it was not cultists, but a tide of crimson flesh and brass armor, demons of the blood, God roaring with hunger. Their axes carved through flak armor as if it were parchment. Their mere presence made las beams gutter and laser guns seize, machine spirits recoiling from the warp stench. Under that onslaught, under the sight of skull helms and the sense of their own fragility, the line cracked. Men turned, men ran. They broke for the rear, stumbling over each other, discarding weapons, clawing at the ice as if they could dig themselves into it and hide. They were still running when Russ dropped onto the ice in front of them. His armor was splashed in demon ichor and human meat. The wind howled around him. His spear was dark from tip to haft, with blood that smoked and hissed in the chill. He stood alone in their path, a single figure against an entire fleeing regiment. Most tried to stop, some could not. One man, eyes wide and streaming, slid right into the Primarch, colliding with his grieved shin. He bounced off as if he had struck a statue. Russ did not move. He looked over their heads, not at them, to the oncoming demon host. The blood god's children came on at the same relentless pace, uncaring of the break they had induced. They scented more skulls, and that was all that mattered. Russ lifted his spear and drew a line in the ice with its tip. The crack it made was a dark vein, running from one side of the flank to the other. "Behind this line," he said, his voice cutting through the storm, through the thunder of guns, through the panicked babble of the retreat. No one passes. The men skidded to halts, pressed against each other, faces turned up to him. Some sobbed, some snarled, some stared with the empty eyes of those whose courage had snapped under too much weight. Russ turned his head slightly, scanning them, reading the shame and fear in their posture as easily as he would a hunting trail. "You ran," he said. There was no contempt in his tone, only statement. Wolves do not have that luxury. Men who run in the face of the foe without orders shame their pack. Shame must be answered. He nodded to the wolfen pack that loped up behind him, their muzzles flecked with foam and blood, their chains dragging broken anchors through the ice. "Every 10th, Russ said. "Tithe them, let the rest hear, let all Fenris hear, cowardice is meat." Grimnar's voice crackled over the flank vox, rough with shock and anger. "Russ, hold. These are men, not curs. They have stood and bled for days. There are other ways to—" "Later, Logan," Russ cut across him. "Right now, the pack needs a lesson more than it needs a sermon." The Primarch's will was a palpable thing. Officers who would have argued in any other circumstance found the words dying in their throats. Commissars, their own instincts tugging them toward decimation by more conventional means, hesitated, then began grabbing men, shoving them into a separate knot. Every 10th soldier, dragged from the staggered ranks, was pushed forward, struggling, swearing, praying, begging. Some tried to draw weapons. They were disarmed with mechanical efficiency, stripped down to flak and skin. The wolfen moved among them, teeth flashed, claws sank in, screams rose. Men were pulled down, dragged apart, their bodies ripped open and devoured in gnashing gulps. Blood sprayed across the ice, across the faces of their comrades. Vox units, still live from the earlier failure to cut transmissions, carried the shrieks across the bastions and out into the wider defense net. All along the Fang, men heard what happened to those who turned their backs on the enemy. Russ watched, eyes flat. When it was done, when the wolfen were licking gore from their muzzles, and the tithed soldiers were nothing but churned meat under the wolves' claws, he turned back to the survivors. "You will hold that line," he said. "You will hold it not because I say so, or because some far-off Lord Commander has written it into a book, but because you know now that there is nowhere you can run that is safe from judgment. The demons will take your souls. I will take your flesh long before that." He turned then, spear lifted, and charged into the oncoming tide of blood god demons, Wulfen loping at his heel, the newly cowed regiment stumbling after him. Their lasguns spat fire that shook in their hands, but none of them broke again. Later, when the line had held and the dead were being dragged into new walls, Grimnar found Russ in a storm-lashed chamber deep within the Fang. Wind moaned in the chimneys. The stone walls sweated chill. A single flame burned in the center of the room, a low blue fire that fed on rune-etched bones. Shadows danced in ways that did not match the flicker of the light, twisting and jarring. Russ sat on a slab of rock, carved with half-finished sagas, his spear across his knees. He had stripped his armor down to its underlayers, steam, rising from the scars and ritual brands that scored his skin. His hair hung in wet tangles. "You made beasts eat men," Grimnar said without preamble. "Our men. Men who had already given more blood than most will ever see spilled." Russ did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were tired, but there was no regret there. "I made the pack remember," he replied. "They forgot, Logan. They forgot what we are." "We are defenders," Grimnar snapped, "of this world, of the Imperium, of the All-Father's vision." Russ snorted. "I am the All-Father's executioner," he said. "That was what he made me. That is what he loosed me upon the stars to do. You think that changed because he sits silent on his throne? You think the title he gave me burned away with Prospero and all the rest?" Grimnar's fists clenched. "Mercy is not weakness," he said. "In this age, mercy is indulgence," Russ countered. "Tell me, Logan, what has mercy bought the Imperium? A rift torn through its heart. Worlds that want to break away. Lords that think they can play at crowns while the galaxy burns. We spared too many in the old days. We bound too few. Now the bill has come due." "You cannot rule men by fear alone," Grimnar said. Russ laughed, a harsh bark. "I am not here to rule anyone," he said. "I am here to hunt, to kill, until there is nothing left that threatens the species our father broke so many worlds to uplift. The wolves at the campfire need to know that the fire will burn them as happily as it burns the forest if they dart too close. That is the only language some understand." He leaned forward. "You led well in my absence, Logan," he said, tone softening for a heartbeat. "I see the strength in your sons. I see the tales carved into the Fang since I walked into the storm. But do not mistake the practices you have developed for gospel. The galaxy has grown hungrier than you know. It will take more than careful rationing of cruelty to feed it." Grimnar held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a short, stiff motion. "We are not done with this," he said. "We are not done with anything," Russ replied. "Not until there is no one left to swing a blade." While the ice around the Fang ran with blood, war raged elsewhere. On the forge moon of Ingir's anvil, loyalist and traitor Titan Legios met in a duel that shook the crust. The moon was a sphere of iron and fire, its surface a maze of manufactoria stacks, assembly yards, and god-machine temples. Once it had built titans for the Imperium alone. Now, half its forges served the Dark Mechanicum, turning out warped engines crowned with skulls and dragged along by chains of bound demons. On that day, the earth buckled under the stride of walking mountains. On one side advanced a loyalist legio, their titans' heraldry worn but proud, their carapaces bearing kill glyphs from campaigns that stretched back to the earliest days of the heresy. Reaver titans with volcano cannons and melter lances, warlords with entire cathedra of guns upon their backs, warhounds darting and weaving between their feet. Opposing them, twisted mirrors. Traitor titans, their frames warped by exposure to the eye, armor plated with living metal that writhed and blinked, void shields flickering with faces pressed outward from the Empyrean. Their weapons barked demon flame and corrosive energies that ate through rock and steel alike. Volcano cannon fire turned Manufactoria stacks to molten slag. Plasma annihilators roared, spearing through void shields in blinding lances, punching holes through carapaces, turning internal decks into boiling storms of superheated air and disintegrating crew. Each step crushed entire cohorts of Skitarii and mortal soldiers underfoot, their bodies ground into paste in an instant. Under the knees of those gods, Leman Russ ran. He led a strike force of wolves and Mechanicus Skitarii, along forgotten maintenance thoroughfares and undercarriage access ways, into the shadowed world beneath the Titan's treads. Here, the thunder of weapons was a distant pressure, the true danger coming in the form of sudden earthquakes as Titans shifted position, their vast weight warping the very structure of the moon. They moved like a hunting pack, staying in the blind arcs of sensor arrays, slipping between plates and along the ribs of the god machines. They hit the first traitor Titan at its ankle. Demolition charges planted at stress points along the joint went off in a rolling series of concussions, tearing away armor and twisted cables. Sparks and warp lightning crackled from the exposed mechanisms. The Titan staggered, its massive foot slamming down off true, crushing one of its own escorting demon engines into a crater of smoking wreckage. Russ led the charge up into the wound. They climbed into the Titan's lower decks, through tunnels now open to the war-torn air, hacking through cultist engine seers and corrupted servitors that tried to stop them. Half-machine men swung chain axes in clumsy arcs. Wolves took their heads off with single blows, bolters roaring in the confined spaces, the sound deafening. They reached the Princeps's cockpit as the wounded god machine tried to turn. The sanctum was a chamber of nerve cables and pulsing biomatter. The Princeps wired into a throne of living metal. His eyes rolled back in his skull. His awareness spread through tons of steel. Moderati twitched at their stations, their bodies studded with the plugs of the manifold. Russ stepped into that holy violation of machine and man, his presence making the air seem to still. The corrupted Princeps felt him. For a heartbeat, his gaze snapped back from the extended senses of the Titan to the physical confines of his cockpit. He saw a giant in wolf-engraved armor standing amid the cables, like a barbarian king in a cathedral, spear in hand. He tried to scream, a curse. Russ hurled the spear. It punched through the throne and the Princeps both, pinning him to the back of the cockpit. Warp-tainted fluids burst from ruptured conduits, spraying the chamber in luminescent goo that hissed as it hit ceramite. The Titan convulsed, its legs buckling. Outside, the engine collapsed, its knees slamming into the Manufactoria ground, its upper carapace crashing into a half-completed assembly tower. Loyalist Titans poured fire into the falling giant, stripping its armor, blowing apart its weapons, turning it into a burning pile of wreckage. The Wolf King dragged his spear free from the corpse and moved on. In war councils held between such strikes, Russ read the war like a trail. Hololithic projectors cast sectors into the air above the table, glowing runes marking active fronts, fleet movements, known enemy concentrations, suspected warp anomalies. To most commanders, it was a map of lines and densities. To Russ, it was a scent on the wind.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go, be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
He stalked around the projections, bare feet or booted, depending on the state of his armor, eyes flicking from marker to marker. He did not see strong points and shipping lanes. He saw layers and running paths. He saw alpha predators and carrion feeders, trails of force and intent as clear to him as tracks in fresh snow. "Here," he said, stabbing a finger at a cluster of glyphs around a warp nexus labeled in cold administratum script as nothing more than a navigation hazard. "This is a throat. The enemy passes through it because they must, because the currents of the warp and the limits of their engines give them no choice. We choke it. We starve everything beyond. That world is a hell, An Imperial Navy admiral protested, his face pale in the rune glow. It barely supports a garrison. The atmosphere is poison, the ground unstable, the warp storms constant. To hold it, we would have to commit almost everything we have left in that quadrant. To assault it is to throw lives into a furnace. To open a corridor for the Regent's reinforcements, Russ replied. To give Guilliman a straight line through the storms to our system. To keep his fleets from being chewed apart piecemeal by the Black Legion while their navigators curse the dark. Yes, we throw lives into the furnace. That is what they are for. You would abandon these worlds, another commander said, gesturing to a cluster of loyal systems marked in amber, already under attack. You would leave them to burn. Some kills you do not contest, Russ said. You bleed the prey you cannot save to draw in the bigger predator. Then you take its throat. He pointed to the amber cluster, then to the warp nexus, then to the symbols denoting the Black Legion's main fleet groups. They will commit to those easy feasts, he said. The traitors and their demon masters will gorge themselves on those worlds. While they do, we take the nexus. We close the throat. When they turn to see who has crept into their den, their way back is choked with our teeth. Silence met his words. Men who had spent their lives balancing equations of loss and gain, of supply and attrition, found themselves looking at the map with new eyes, seeing not abstract assets, but the flow of hunger and fear. 20 billion, the Lord General Militant murmured at last. That is the projection. That is what it will take to take and hold that hell world long enough to secure the corridor. 20 billion souls committed, knowing only perhaps 1 million will live past the first standard week. Russ shrugged. Then those million will have earned their sagas, he said, and the 20 billion will have bought a path that may keep this side of the galaxy from joining the other in eternal night. On the hell world, the numbers became flesh. The warp nexus hung above it like a permanent storm, a knot of roiling unreality that spat lightning and screamed in voices, that shredded sanity. The sky was a bruise of sickly colors. The ground boiled and cooled and cracked in cycles too fast for geology, spewing fumes that corroded armor and lungs alike. Into that, regiments dropped. Cohorts of guard in hazard masks stumbled from dropcraft into sulfur-choked winds, their boots sinking into ash that sometimes shifted away to reveal chasms of molten stone. Siege regiments tried to dig in, only to have their trenches collapse or fill with bubbling warp ooze that grew teeth. Elysian-style drop troops fell from the skies, many never reaching the ground as unseen claws plucked them from the air and tore them into red mist. They kept coming. Artillery pieces were dragged into place by armored haulers whose engines screamed, their crews coughing blood into their rebreathers. Titans landed on half-solid ground, their feet melting the surface even as they sank into it. They braced and fired anyway, stabilizing pistons driven deep into the churn to hold them steady. Everything died. Cultist hordes boiled out of fissures and broken shrines, skittering on limbs that were not all their own, screaming praises to powers that made the warp nexus spin faster. Demons erupted from vortexes, carving through companies in heartbeats, guzzling souls like wine. Traitor Astartes teleported into command centers in blasts of crimson light, their chain blades harvesting heads in neat rows. Still, the Imperium pushed forward, driven by orders from a voice they had not heard, but whose echoes their commanders carried like a burning brand. Every meter gained cost regiments. Entire armies vanished into the vortex or were crushed under collapsing land. The million who survived the first week did so by wading through drifts of corpses and shell casings, by learning which parts of reality could be trusted for step and aim, and which could not. Leman Russ walked there too. On a mountain of bodies that had once been a hill town, he met a demon prince of Khorne. The creature stood taller than a warhound titan, its flesh a living armor of brass and scar tissue. Chains hung from its horns, each one threaded with skulls still dripping spectral blood. Its axe was a slab of metal big enough to cut a bane blade in two with a single stroke, serrated with the fused teeth of 1,000 species. It roared as it saw him, a sound like tectonic plates grinding together. "Little wolf," it bellowed, voice buzzing with flies and distant screams. "The blood god remembers you. He remembers the worlds you bled in his name, without even knowing you tithed to him. Come, pay the rest of what you owe." Russ laughed at it. "You are the 4th prince of your kind I have killed this month," he said. "The first 3 at least tried to say something amusing." He charged. They met with a collision that sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. Guardsmen in the middle of firing laser guns were suddenly flung from their feet, thrown into walls of meat and rubble. Lesser demons were shredded by the sheer pressure of the impact, their bodies tearing apart in streaks of red that painted the air. The axe came down, roaring with stolen souls. Russ caught the haft on his spear, the 2 weapons locking in a flare of energy that lit the mountain of corpses beneath them. He braced, muscles standing out like cables beneath his armor, boots sinking into the yielding ground of dead flesh. The demon prince grinned, rows of fangs grinding. "You cannot stand against me," it snarled. "I was a world's worth of murder before the warp kissed me. I have drowned continents in blood since. Every drop makes me stronger. Every skull you spill today feeds me." Russ spat into its face. "Then choke," he said, and twisted. He slid along the haft, stepping inside the prince's guard with a speed that contradicted his size. His spear bit into demon flesh, carving a long, deep wound along the creature's side, spilling ichor that burned where it fell. The prince roared and backhanded him, a blow that would have pulped a knight. Russ flew through a ruined hab block. Stone and twisted metal exploded around him. He hit another heap of bodies, bones breaking under his impact, then was up and moving again, spear in hand, grin savage. They tore the battlefield apart. Each clash sent buildings tumbling, reduced bastions to rubble, turned trenches into mass graves. Russ drove the prince back, then was forced into a defensive role as the axe scythed out, missing his head by the width of a hair. He took wounds that would have killed any Astartes, rents in his armor where warp taint tried to crawl in. He burned it out with sheer, stubborn fury. At last, atop a ridge formed entirely of skulls and half-frozen meat, he feinted low and then leapt, landing on the prince's arm as it swung, running up it like a beast scaling a cliff. His spear stabbed down, once, twice, again, each thrust sinking deeper into corrupted flesh. He reached the thing's neck and hewed. The spear sang. The prince's head came free in a spray of luminous blood and shrieking embers. The body staggered, took 3 enormous steps, then crashed down the slope, crushing its own lesser kin. The head, still snarling, still spitting curses in a dozen tongues, dangled from Russ's grip by its chain. He dragged it back to Fenris. On a polar plain, where the fighting had never really ceased, he hammered a spike of ice into the ground with his own hands and rammed the prince's head down onto it. The chain rattled. The eyes still glowed faintly. Guardsmen marched past, glancing up at it, taking a grim, shivering comfort from the sight. So much blood was spilled on that plain that the snow changed. It began as a grey slush, shot through with pink and brown. Then it deepened. Wave after wave of cultists and traitors died under lass fire and artillery and the blades of wolves, their bodies torn apart, their blood soaking into the drifts. Traitor Astartes lay in broken pieces, ceramite and bone scattered. Demons died and died again, their essence burning as it was forced back into the warp. The blizzards turned red. Snowflakes fell stained with iron, swirling in crimson veils over the trenches and emplacements. Guardsmen marched knee-deep through frozen gore, their boots making sick, sucking sounds with every step. Artillery shells flensed apart oceans of dead, hurling strips of meat into the air to freeze before they landed. Men grew used to wiping a rime of dried blood from their respirators. They called it the Red Snowfall, and the name stuck even in official communiques. With every victory, with every daemon slain, with every traitor broken, the wolves' sagas grew longer. Yet the cost was a weight that bent even giants' shoulders. In the storm caves once more, Njal listened. The rune bones cracked differently now. The fire burned with a more frenetic light, sparks leaping in jagged arcs. The world wolves' howls had changed pitch, rising more often into shrill notes that set teeth on edge. When he cast his mind into the warp, he felt an attention there that had not been present before. He went to Russ. "You are seen," he said without ceremony. "Not just by the lesser filth we have been cutting down. The great beasts feel your teeth. One of them turns its head toward you." Russ cleaned blood from his spear with slow, methodical strokes. "Let it come," he said. "I have killed its princes. I can kill a king." "This is no mere prince of the blood god," Njal warned. "This is one of your brothers, twisted beyond recognition, given over to rage until only a shard of him remains. A demon Primarch stirs, answering your challenge." Russ's grin was all wolf. "Good," he said. "The hunt has been good meat so far. It is fitting that a greater beast finally joins it." The storm outside the Fang howled, and far across the stars, something, vast and red, turned its burning gaze toward Fenris. The warp storms parted like torn curtains, and a new blaze of light flooded the Fenris system. Where the Black Legion's fleets were jagged scars against the void, the new arrivals were a wall. Line upon line of warships translated from the Immaterium, their prows crowned with eagles and laureled helms, their flanks bearing the sigils of Ultramar and 100 and more successor chapters. Battle barges as large as cities, strike cruisers in ordered phalanxes, sleek escort squadrons sheathing them in a moving cage of guns. Behind them came the weight of the Imperium's spine, armadas of Imperial Navy capital ships, their decks crammed with fighters and bombers, their macro-cannon banks already grinding through loading cycles. Mechanicus Arc Mechanicus hulks, bristling with lance arrays and crawling with docks that held ranks of knights and god machines. Logistics vessels by the hundred, hulking silhouette stacks and fuel tankers, and grain hulks, all riding in the lee of the guns. It was not a fleet, it was a mobile front. At its core floated a Gloriana-class flagship, a relic of the Great Crusade, rebuilt and reforged for a new age. Its hull was a continent of ceramite and armor glass, its surface cut by cathedral spires and bastions bristling with guns. Where once such vessels had been owned by individual legions, this one bore the sigils of the office of Lord Commander. It was the Anastasia, the personal flagship of Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Regent of the Imperium. Its shadow fell across Fenris like another storm. They chose it as their meeting ground, not on the Fang, whose stone would remember every word spoken, not on the Hrafkal, whose hull was a walking curse to everything that had ever called the warp home, a neutral peak between worlds, above a planet that had already soaked up too much history in too little time. Within one of the Anastasia's high audience chambers, brothers met again. The chamber was a cathedral of steel and stained armor glass, its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of the Great Crusade that had never quite happened that way. Marble tiles underfoot bore the sigils of 1,000 compliant worlds, polished by the passage of boot and servo. Statues of Primarchs in idealized glory stood in alcoves, the faces of some covered in veils of black. At the far end, beneath a looming aquila, Robuta Guilliman stood. He was taller than any Astartes, his warplate a thing of artifice and brutal function, cerulean and gold wrapped around a frame that was both soldier and statesman. The armor of fate whispered with machine spirits, its plates inscribed with litanies of duty and sacrifice. The Emperor's sword hung at his hip, its sheath covered in purity seals and warning sigils. His face was a mask of hard calm, the weight of 10,000 years, and a shattered empire resting in the lines around his eyes. Leman Russ walked toward him, the sound of his bootsteps echoing. He had not cleaned his armor entirely for this meeting. Demon ichor had been scraped away, where it interfered with the functioning of joints and seals, but the grooves and pits left behind were still black with old violence. His pelt cloak trailed behind him, patched from a dozen beasts none of the Anathasia's servitors could catalogue. His spear rested in one hand, tipped down, as if to avoid making a point that would cut more than pride. Behind Guilliman stood ranks of honor guard in ultramarine blue and gold, shields and power blades ready, helms tracking every motion. Behind Russ waited Wolfguard in wolf grey and bone, storm shields and frost blades gleaming, teeth bared in expressions that were not smiles. The tension between them hung thick, a static charge waiting for a spark. For a moment, the two Primarchs simply looked at each other. They saw ghosts in each other's faces, the memories of 1,000 councils, 1,000 battlefields, the last glimpses of the siege, when everything had been breaking and nothing had yet fallen apart as completely as it had now. They saw the 10 millennia between those moments written in scars, and in the ways their gazes did not quite match what the statues around them showed. "Robute," Russ said at last, voice a rough rasp that still carried easily. "Leman," Guilliman replied, his tone level, clipped high Gothic. "You look as if the Eye has tried very hard to kill you and failed." "It is a poor hunter," Russ said. "I had hoped the same would not be said of you." Brows tightened around the chamber. A serf in Ultramar livery shifted his weight and nearly dropped his data slate under the pressure of so much concentrated attention. Guilliman let the barb pass with only a slight tightening of the jaw. "You have made quite an impact," he said. "The entire segmentum reports your return. The astropathic choirs will not stop screaming your name. Every warlord and heretic who can spell Wolf King is now fantasizing about mounting your skull on a fortress wall." "Then they will come," Russ said. "That is the point." The regent inhaled once, a slow, steadying breath that would have looked like a sigh on anyone smaller. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the long adamantium and oak table between them. "We have much to discuss, and little time in which the galaxy will permit us the indulgence of words." They sat. The Honor Guard and Wolf Guard remained standing, a ring of ceramite and suspicion. Hololithic projections sprang up from the table's surface, drawing a web of light between them. The map was a galaxy sliced into bleeding sections, with the Great Rift a wound of shadow down the middle. Fenris burned bright at the junction of a dozen threat markers and fleet glyphs. Other fronts glowed in different colors, each one a site of war so vast it could have filled entire histories alone. "Here is the carcass we are trying to keep on its feet," Guilliman said. "You have seen your slice of it. This is the rest." Russ watched in silence for a time. He saw the dance of fleets, the broken segments where communication failed, the jagged lines where Terranid hive tendrils gnawed at the edges, where Necron tomb dialects pushed up from below, where orcs gathered into new empires. He sniffed, eyes narrowing, seeing not just positions, but hungers, pressures, strengths. "You are trying to fight the night with ledgers," he said at last. Guilliman's gaze snapped back to him. "I am trying to fight entropy with structure," he replied. "When our father built this Imperium, he did so with vision and force and a great deal of blood. When he was struck down, what remained was a monstrous engine that needed maintenance and guidance. Someone had to codify the madness into something that could survive." "You penned a book," Russ said, lips peeling back from his teeth. "I have spent 10,000 years learning to kill gods." "Without that book," Guilliman said, and there was steel now under the measured tone, "there would be no Imperium left for you to return to. The legions would have torn it apart in internecine war within a handful of centuries. The administratum would have collapsed under its own weight. The Astartes would have become a plague of warlords, worse than the worst of the arch-traitor's spawn. Russ leaned back in his chair, spear resting across his thighs, fingers tapping idly on the haft. "And yet here we are," he said. "The Astartes fractured, the lords bloated and treacherous, the administratum a beast that eats its own young. Your ledger army held the line for a time, brother. I will give you that. But we have passed the point where columns of losses and gains can be balanced. The enemy does not tally, it devours. We must shepherd what remains," Guilliman insisted. "We must preserve, reinforce, recover. The crusades I wage are not for glory. They are for infrastructure, for supply chains, for rebuilding the mechanisms that allow anything to stand at all. You see everything as a hunt. There are more shapes to war than that." Russ's eyes flashed. "And you see it as a series of campaigns that can be won by proper positioning of men and materiel," he snarled. "You think if you shuffle enough numbers in your fortress of paper, the universe will take pity. It will not. The things coming for us are not impressed with your logistics." His fist hit the table, making the hololiths quiver. "Terror breaks them," he said. "Relentless hunts that never let them rest. We turn their nights into the same nightmares they have visited on us. We do not hold the line. We run ahead of it and tear out the throats of anything that thinks to cross." Around the table, Space Wolf leaders bristled with fierce approval. They had not liked the weight of the Regent's gaze on them, the talk of folding their savagery into neat columns and chains of command. Some mortal generals and captains, hardened by years of watching orders from distant segmentum commands, failed to account for the reality of their fronts, found themselves nodding along with the Wolf King's brutal clarity. Others stared at Russ with a mix of horror and reluctant fascination. There was something intoxicating about the thought of discarding rules and protocols and letting pure predatory wrath off its leash. More than one Lord General, more than one Admiralty officer felt a treacherous thought bloom, that perhaps the Imperium needed a wolf on the throne more than another administrator. Guilliman saw that flicker in their eyes. He had grown very good at seeing such things. He held Russ's gaze and refused to look away. "If I unleashed you without check," he said, "quiet now, dangerous, you would burn a path across the stars that would make even the Black Crusades look measured. You would kill what needs to be killed, yes. You would also kill worlds that simply fail to fight to your standard. You would turn the Imperium into an endless cull. If that cull leaves behind a lean, hard thing that survives, what of it?" Russ shot back. "The weak have done us no favor." "There must be something left worth saving," Guilliman said. "Otherwise, why are we fighting at all?" For a moment, the old brotherhood flickered between them. The memory of sitting in strategium chambers on the Great Crusade, arguing over whether to save a world or burn it, but always with the sense that there had been time and space and resources enough to mitigate the worst choices. That time was gone. A data officer, hands trembling slightly, interrupted with a report. Guilliman listened, eyes tightening, then turned back to Russ. "News from elsewhere," he said. "The Lion walks again. Lion L. Johnson leads a shadow crusade, striking from the dark at foes we barely have names for, shoring up the night where even the Astronomican's light does not reach." Russ's face darkened. He remembered the sting of the lion's fists, the crack of bones, the taste of dust and blood. He remembered their brawl, two demigods beating each other bloody while their legions watched. He remembered grudges that had never quite been put to rest before the heresy tore them apart. A low growl started in his chest, then twisted into something like a bitter laugh. "So the first crawls from his hole as well," he said. "About time. I had thought he might sulk in the dark until the stars went out, polishing his honor while the rest of us choked." "Do you still hold that grudge?" Guilliman asked. There was no mocking in the question, only genuine concern. The last thing he needed was two of his most dangerous brothers tearing at each other while the galaxy burned. Russ considered. The galaxy has grown dark enough that even he may be forgiven, he said at last, if he kills what needs killing, if he does not get in my way. It was not an apology. It was as close as the Wolf King came. They circled then to the matter that had been brewing beneath every word. The wolves, Guilliman said. Your legion, what remains of it under the chapter divisions, and all the successor formations bearing your gene seed. They are an asset the Imperium cannot afford to squander, nor can it afford to let them remain entirely outside the structure that has kept us from total collapse. You want to put a collar on us, Russ said flatly. I want you bound more tightly to the Codex Astartes, Guilliman replied, to proper fleet integration, to campaigns planned in concert with other forces, not simply run as independent hunts. Your savagery is an edge, but an edge that must be guided, not left to skitter through our own flesh. Russ's hand tightened on his spear. If you try to bind us too, tightly, he said, each word hard, I will take my sons, all of them, every great company that will answer, every successor with enough wolf left in its blood. We will turn our backs on your crusades. We will range ahead of your lines, out of your Vox range, killing in the dark where your charts do not reach. The Imperium will benefit from the corpses left behind, but we will not be leashed. The air in the chamber thickened. Wolfguard shifted, fingers flexing on storm shields. Ultramarines. Honor Guard stepped forward minutely, blades half raised. This was a knife edge, finer than any wielded by assassins. Guilliman opened his mouth to answer, to try and thread the gap between necessary control and the risk of shattering what fragile unity they had. The warp screamed. It hit the anesthesia like a hammer, a psychic shockwave that made mortals convulse and cogitators spit sparks. The hololith between the Primarchs exploded into static and then into ghostly images of leering. Faces, mouths opening in voiceless laughter. Reality buckled along the chamber's walls. Cracks appeared in the armor glass, not following any sane line of stress, but spiderwebbing in patterns that hurt the eye. From those fractures, blackness seeped, dripping to the floor where it pooled and then rose, forming shapes. Demons pushed through from somewhere sideways, their claws leaving gashes in the metal as they used the ship's structure as a birth canal. The Honor Guard reacted instantly, raising shields, forming a line between the Primarchs and the incoming threat. Wolfguard moved as one, stepping around Russ, forming a rough ring, their fangs bared in anticipation. Contained incursion in Section Delta, a distant voice screamed over the anesthesia's vox. Warp breach in Primary Strategium, Geller field flicker, all hands to... The channel dissolved into a howl. Demons poured in. They were a mixed brood, no single patron claiming this particular insult. Fluid things with too many eyes, exoskeletal horrors with chittering mandibles and blades for limbs, mockery warriors in twisted plate that parodied Astartes' armor, their weapons made of writhing shadow. They came for the brightest souls in reach, the twin beacons of Primarch presence like bonfires in a night full of gnats. Guilliman drew the Emperor's sword in a smooth motion, its blade igniting with a golden fire that burned away the shadows where it passed. Russ surged to his feet with a growl, spear already in his hand, cloak snapping behind him. They stepped back to back without thinking. The first wave hit the ring of Honor and Wolfguard and broke like a tide on rock. Shields flared, blades sang. Frost and fire cut through warped flesh, unmaking it with each stroke. Still, demons slipped between legs and over shoulders, seeking the Primarchs, drawn to them as moths to flames. One lunged at Guilliman, a serpent of shadow and teeth. His sword cut it in two mid-leap, the blade's golden flare turning its body to ash before the halves could hit the floor. Another leapt for Russ's throat, a howling thing of brass and bone. His spear punched through its chest and pinned it to the deck, the demon's scream cut short as it crumbled. More came. Russ roared with wordless fury, hurling himself into the thickest of the pack. His spear whirled, leaving arcs of killing light. He caught a demon by the neck, wrenched its head clean off, and threw the remains into a knot of its fellows. His laughter, harsh and savage, filled the chamber. Guilliman fought with the precise, relentless economy of a master swordsman honed by endless wars. Every stroke was measured, every cut killed. The Emperor's sword cleaved through demons as if they were made of mist, sections of warped flesh evaporating into shrieks at the merest touch. He moved in concert with Russ, despite the gulf of centuries and ideology, the old patterns of Legion war drills surfacing in instinct. "Still think fury is enough," Guilliman grunted, severing 3 demons in a single sweeping cut. "Still think numbers will save you," Russ growled back, caving in the chest of a towering beast with a kick that broke the floor beneath it. For a span of heartbeats that stretched long, the war for the Imperium narrowed to that chamber. 2 brothers, back to back, killing monsters in a storm of blood and light. The breach began to close. Whatever sorcerer or warp event had triggered it faltered under the focused wrath of 2 Primarchs. The cracks in the walls stopped widening. The flow of demons slowed, then ceased. Those that remained were cut down, their essence dragged screaming back into whatever hellscape had vomited them forth. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of damaged hololith emitters and the hiss of the Emperor's sword, cooling as Guilliman willed its fire to dim. The chamber was a ruin. Statues lay toppled, their idealized faces smashed. This hololithic table was a slagged mess of metal and melted projectors. Honor Guard and Wolf Guard alike lay dead or wounded among piles of demon residue. The air stank of ozone and hot metal and the faint, lingering tang of the warp. Russ leaned on his spear, breath coming in heavy growls. Guilliman stood straight through sheer will, blood from a dozen minor cuts trickling down his armor to mingle with demon ichor. They looked at each other again. "Whatever else we disagree on," Guilliman said, voice low, "the enemy is very clear about one thing. It fears us together." Russ spat a gobbet of dark blood onto the cracked floor. "Then let us give it cause," he said. They talked then, more quietly. In the wreck of the Strategium, surrounded by the dead and the dying, with repair crews already moving in around them in nervous, reverent silence, they carved out a shape of compromise. "You cannot be leashed," Guilliman said. "If I try too hard, I will drive you into outright rebellion, and the Imperium cannot survive a civil war between its few remaining Primarchs. You cannot afford to have another warlord carving his own empire out of the carcass," Russ acknowledged. "If I simply run where I please, too many will follow, and your careful scaffolding will collapse." "Then this," Guilliman said. "You will be a hunter king. I will point you at the darkest regions, the worst threats. You will take your wolves and whatever allies you convince to run with you, and you will scour those places clean. You will not concern yourself with garrisons or tithe rolls or rebuilding. You will be the spear thrown ahead, not the shield held in place." "And you," Russ said. "I will hold the spine," Guilliman replied. "I will keep the administratum from eating itself. I will keep the navy moving. I will keep the chapters coordinated. I will negotiate with Xenos, where extermination is not yet feasible. I will do the work of a regent, as our father intended. Someone must." Russ grunted. "You point. I kill," he said. "We both do what we were made for. So long as you do not try to count my kills too closely, we will manage." "There will be times I ask you to hold," Guilliman said. "Times I order you to stay your hand for a greater gain down the line. You will not always like it." "I never have," Russ said. "But I have obeyed when I saw the sense. Do not insult me by thinking I am blind." They sealed the accord not with signatures or wax, but with the clasp of forearms, gauntlet to gauntlet, in the old way. Afterwards, when Russ and his Wolf Guard had returned to the Hrafnkel to ready for departure, Guilliman stood in a side chamber with his inner circle. Senior captains, chapter masters of certain key chapters, a Magos Dominus, whose metal fingers twitched incessantly, a Lord Admiral with haunted eyes. "He is a weapon," the Admiral said, "a very sharp one, and a dangerous one, even in the hand that wields him," Leman replied. "He will win you wars," the Magos intoned, vox filters flattening his tone into mechanical chant. Statistics extrapolated from his initial campaigns already suggest a significant reduction in projected losses in zones where his fleet operates freely. "He will also teach men to love the hunt more than the thing being hunted," one of the chapter masters said quietly. I saw it in the eyes of some of the guard officers. They looked at him and saw not a burdened Lord Commander, but a chieftain they might follow into a simpler, bloodier order. Leman looked out of the armor glass at the distant shape of the Hrafnkel. Her hull was a scar against the stars, demon bones and rune wards glistening. Around her, other wolf ships gathered, engines bright, ready to plunge back into the warp toward whatever new darkness Russ chose to bleed. "He has spent 10,000 years learning to kill gods," Leman said softly. "He has learned to live as pure predator. If ever the hunt is all that remains to him, if ever there is no Imperium left to tie his running to, no brothers left to argue with him, I do not know what he will become." He did not voice the final fear, that one day the Imperium might find itself not only defending against traitor Primarchs and alien nightmares, but from a wolf king for whom the difference between prey and ally had worn thin. Outside, engines flared. The wolf ships turned their prows toward the deepest dark. The hunt moved on. They called it the Void Pack, because no other name fit. It was not a crusade in the way the Administratum used the term, with neat designations and numbered phases. It was a moving wound in the firmament, a mass of teeth and guns and reactors, a fleet that hunted. At its head ran the Hrafnkel and her sister ships, their hulls still crusted in demon bone and rune wards, their vox arrays perpetually bleeding the long, low howl that had become their signature. Around them gathered the great companies of the Space Wolves, their strike cruisers and battle barges bristling with launch bays and murder. Primaris' successor, chapters bearing Russ's gene seed, formed outer rings, their vessels newer, their paint less scarred, but their war spirits already learning to snarl. They were not alone. Night houses swore oaths to the Wolf King, their towering engines walking in the holds of Mechanicus transports or clamping themselves to the backs of troop barges like gargoyles. Black Templars' ships slotted into the formation, their hulls black and white, their chaplains' litanies adding another rhythm of fury to the fleet's drumbeat. Entire battle groups of the Imperial Navy fell in with them, their crews too exhausted or awed or terrified to do anything but follow. In the troop decks and holds, billions of men waited. Astra Militarum regiments from a dozen segmenta, drawn from death worlds and hive stacks and shrines, all crammed into steel coffins that stank of recycled air and fear. Their officers spoke of crusade doctrines and contingent objectives. The men spoke of the Wolf King and the way his coming had turned defeat into slaughter. Somewhere in the buzzing depths of the Administratum, a scribe carved a designation into an already overloaded slate. To those who walked the decks and crouched in the trenches, it never passed their lips. To them, it was the Void Pack. It hunted. The first kills were easy, by the standards of that age. A Chaos war cluster had been gnawing on the fringes of the Fenris Reach, its fleets and warbands moving along weakened warp currents, sniffing for worlds too slow to raise shields. Russ took the Void Pack out along that trail, following scorch marks and astropathic screams across system after system. On a shrine moon, where the only water lay in frozen reliquary pools, they found a cult uprising that had turned Cathedra into butchers' halls. The Void Pack fell on it like a pack of Fenrisian wolves upon a wounded elk. Drop pods smashed through spire roofs. Space wolves stormed down aisles slick with congealed blood, bolters barking, chains wards chewing. Black Templars formed shield walls around altar steps, pushing forward step by step, their oath-bound rage a physical force. In the streets outside, guard regiments cleared hab blocks room by room, lasfire turning stained glass saints into shrapnel. Tens of billions died in hours, the planet's population scythed down so thoroughly that only the most steadfast or luckiest pockets of loyalists remained. The cult banners burned. The demon engines that had dragged themselves up from the planet's core were torn apart and left twitching in the open air until their bound entities howled back into the warp. On a demon world that had once been an agri planet, its fields turned to fields of flayed skin and its rivers running with clotted ichor, the Void Pack repeated the process. They burned swaths of unreality away with saturating lance fire. They landed in zones where reality still held by threads and fought their way inward to kill the exalted champion who had made the world his forge of atrocity. When they left, the planet was a glassed nightmare, the air still stinking of roasted souls. Every victory left dead worlds behind. Populations counted only in the way that dead things are counted, as a weight in the warp and a change in the statistical curves of imperial demographers who would never see the battlefields their quills recorded. On the hive cluster of Jarnsverd Reach, the Void Pack showed another face of liberation. The cluster was a chain of hives strung out across a gas giant's upper atmosphere. Vast carcasses of metal and hab stacked atop one another, their spires piercing the cloud layers, their roots dangling into the storms. Chaos had come there in whispers and symbols, corrupting administratum clerks and manufactorum overseers, seeding 8 pointed stars into the corners of ration tickets and wage reports. By the time the Black Legion arrived, half the cluster had already turned. The Void Pack broke the traitor fleet in a week of real space-time, pinning it between the hives and the gas giant's gravity well, tearing ships open with melter torpedoes and boarding actions that left their decks awash in blood. When the guns fell silent, Russ ordered the hives taken, not recaptured. Space wolves and Black Templars descended through the atmosphere, their drop pods punching through the heavy air, their thrusters roaring. Guard regiments rode in on lighter craft, their hulls rattling as atmospheric winds tried to tear them apart. They went floor by floor. Chaos sigils had been painted on doors, on foreheads, on the walls of habs. Some were crude, drawn in the blood of the first sacrifices. Others were subtle, etched into support struts, hidden behind devotional icons. The taint of the warp crawled through the place, clinging to air recyclers and water reclamation systems. Russ's orders were simple. Any man bearing the mark burned. Any man with warp sigils carved into flesh, wearing amulets, clinging too hard to altered scriptures, died. Any who had been seen kneeling at the wrong altars died. Any whose eyes gleamed too brightly in the dark when the litanies were recited died. There were no allowances for ignorance, no exemptions for those who had only mouthed the words to keep their ration chits. They were herded into manufactorum yards and promethium processing plants. Orbital picked feeds recorded the oceans of bodies, the flood of humanity stripped down and stacked like cordwood. Servitors operated the furnaces, their lobotomized faces blank, their metal arms feeding limbs and torsos into gaping mouths of fire. The smell rose through the hive levels and out into the clouded sky, a stench of roasted meat and burned hair. In command, bunkers across the hive cluster, officers watched through squawking picked screens and tried not to retch. On one such bunker, a Lord General militant found his nerve. He was a tall man, gaunt from long campaigns, his uniform threadbare at the edges, his medals dulled by smoke and wear. His eyes were bloodshot from weeks without sleep, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Lord Russ," he said, standing in the shadow of the Wolf King's presence, picked screens flickering around them with images of the furnaces in action. This is not liberation. This is extermination. There are children down there who do not even understand the sigils daubed on their foreheads. There are elders who have done nothing but pray as they were told. We are murdering those we came to save. Russ watched the screens with a hunter's detachment. He could smell the meat, even this far up, filtered through steel and scrubbers. His eyes tracked the pattern of the killings, the efficiency of it, the way the guard officers obeyed, even as they flinched. He turned his head slowly toward the Lord General. "You came to me and to this pack to keep your species alive," he said, "not to keep your conscience clean. Those sigils are hooks. Those mines are footholds. Leave one of those altars standing, one of those little congregations intact, and the warp will grow in it again. You will have bought yourself a reprieve of a century at most, and your descendants will pay in screams." The general's jaw clenched. "There must be a line," he said. "Something we do not cross, or we become the thing we fight." Russ considered him for a heartbeat, then reached to his belt. He drew a bolt pistol, its casing scarred and engraved with old Fenrisian runes. He checked its mag with a flick of his thumb, then held it out, grip first. "If you believe that so strongly," he said calmly, "draw your line. Use this on yourself for your weakness, or on the next traitor you find. Those are your choices." The bolt pistol seemed to grow, heavier as the general took it. He stood there, the weapon in his hand, picked screens showing oceans of bodies feeding furnaces, the low thump of distant guns echoing through the hive bones. Sweat trickled down his spine. He thought of the men he had led into the grinder, of the worlds he had already watched die, of the sons of his bloodline who would never be born if he ended his life here. He thought of the child he had seen on one of the feeds, a small, hollow-eyed thing with a crudely drawn, 8-pointed star carved into its chest by an enthusiastic parent, waiting quietly in line for its turn in the fire. He raised the pistol. For a moment, Russ watched to see which way the barrel would turn. It swung away from the general's own head and toward the door. He walked out, the weapon still in his hand, and down through levels stacked with men and munitions, and out onto a firing line where a group of guardsmen stood, hoods over their heads, bound for refusing to carry out the executions. He put his bolt round through the nearest traitor officer's skull instead, then turned the pistol on the huddled, hooded men. "You will not falter again," he said. "None of us will. The Wolf King is watching." Word spread. The furnaces burned on. In the void pack's teeth closed on a different prey. A chaos fleet, swollen with stolen tonnage and demonic bargains, had taken shelter in the lee of a micro-warp storm, a rift no bigger than a gas giant, but deep enough that its event horizon gnawed at reality. The traitor captains believed the turbulence would deter pursuit. They had not counted on a hunter who saw not shelter, but a trap waiting to be sprung. Russ laid his net carefully. Imperial Navy squadrons slid into place along the storm's outer edges, their void shields flaring as eddies of unreality licked at them. Space Wolf and Successor. Chapter ships took the inner ring, engines on low burn, weapons dark. Mechanicus vessels extended, sensor masts into the storm, their machine spirits calculating trajectories not of physical mass, but of warp pressure. When the jaws closed, they closed fast. Void shields flared to full strength. Lance batteries spat lines of white death into the cluster of chaos vessels huddled tight near the event horizon. Torpedoes streaked in, their melter warheads punching holes into hulls that had not expected to have to raise their shields so quickly. Traitor ships tried to run. Some turned toward the void pack, engines howling, hoping to punch through the line. They found a wall of fire and boarding torpedoes waiting, their prows blasted apart, their decks swarmed by howling wolves. Others tried to dive deeper into the storm, seeking to ride its currents around the trap. The warp had other ideas. The microstorm's mouth yawned wider, as if in hunger. Ships that strayed too close felt their hulls stretched, metal groaning, as if it were being pulled from both ends at once. Men on the decks saw their hands blur as time stuttered. Navigators screamed and clamped their third eyes shut, but there was nowhere to go. The void pack pounded them. Lances walked their beams along hulls, carving open tenders and carriers, spilling traitor craft and daemon engines into the open. Macro batteries vomited shells that punched through one side of vessels and out the other, spinning them in slow, doomed arcs toward the storm's edge. The Hrafnkel's guns roared, her howling vox drowning out the panicked screams of enemy crews. One by one, the Chaos ships slid backward, engines flaming, their prows clawing at nothing. They crossed the invisible threshold. From the Void Pack's vantage, they seemed to stretch and thin as they went, their silhouettes elongating like shadows at sunset. Then they snapped, pulled into the storm, with a sound that was less heard than felt in the bones. Daemon engines howled as their bound entities were torn free, dragged squealing into the rift. Mutants and traitors and mortals died in their millions, their souls ripped from their bodies and fed into the hunger at the storm's heart. When it was over, nothing remained of the fleet but a scattering of debris and a smear of warp light fading into the dark. The pack watched, silent. Russ's presence changed them. Warriors who had once counted their kills in the hundreds began to count in figures that made no sense, numbers of dead so vast that only the tone of the sagas carried their weight. Their savagery spilled over from battlefields into the spaces between. Guardsmen who had fought alongside them began to flinch when they heard the wolves laughing, because the sound carried an edge of hunger that did not always distinguish between friend and foe. In mess decks and barracks, soldiers told stories. They spoke of grey hunters who shot wounded enemies in the belly and walked away smiling, of Primaris wolves who tore out traitors' tongues with their teeth and nailed them to bulkheads as warnings, of Black Templars whose zealous fury, once held in check by chaplains and strictures, now burned hotter in the light of the Wolf King's ruthless doctrine. Efficiency became something almost supernatural. Enemy commanders found their plans unraveled before they had fully formed. Warp nodes that had taken millennia to establish flared and went dark under the Void Pack's attacks. Demon princes who had carved their names into the hide of reality found those names scored out by a spear that had spent too long in the eye to be impressed. The rune priests watched their lord with mixed pride and unease, and Jarl stood on the observation deck of the Hrafnkel one cycle, stormcloak around his shoulders, staff planted against the floor. Beyond the armoured glaze, the warp rippled, a distant sullen bruise against real space. "He is brighter," one of the younger rune priests said, eyes on the distant figure of Russ standing at the prow. When he walks past, the runes on the walls flare. The Geller fields hum like a beast scenting a rival. Njal grunted. "You mistake brightness for purity, pup," he said. "Sometimes a light shines so hard because it is burning itself up from the inside." They watched Russ laugh with his Jarls. It was a harsh, wild sound. His eyes, when the light caught them, shone with a lupine glow that went beyond simple Fenrisian genetics, a warp sheen that made the hackles rise on men who had spent their lives riding the edge of insanity. In council, he spoke of hunts that spanned centuries, of demon fortresses cracked and devoured, in a voice that made those things sound like the only measures that mattered. "Has the warp changed him?" the younger priest asked quietly. "Or has it simply scraped away what was not necessary?" Njal's fingers tightened on his staff. "The eye is a mirror that shows a man the shape he already carried," he said. "But the longer he looks into it, the more he starts to see only that shape. We must be careful, old friend, that our king remembers there is more to his reflection than teeth." The warp answered them. It came as a howl. Every vox in the sector spat static at the same moment. Astropaths doubled over in their cells, blood pouring from their eyes and ears. Even Geller field projectors flickered, their machine spirits snorting and stamping like spooked beasts. The sound that forced its way through was not words at first. It was rage given voice, the grinding of chains dragged across stone, the scream of nails driven into bone, the wet, meaty smack of countless blows, layered over and over until they became a single, endless impact. Then it shaped itself into something like speech. "Wolf!" it bellowed, the syllables shaking bulkheads and rattling teeth. "Allfather's mongrel, you still run!" Images slammed into unwilling minds. A giant in blood red and brass, his flesh a map of scars and implants, his skull crowned. With nails that burned, axes the size of gunships dripping with soul stuff, worlds screaming as they died, entire populations reduced to skulls in pyramids that stabbed at the sky. "I am free," the voice roared. "I am rage unbound. Come, die howling. Let us see which of us the blood god favors." Angron, the Red Angel, demon Primarch of the World Eaters. His challenge rolled across the warp, cutting through the noise of 1,000 lesser demons, his hatred given priority by the very medium that carried it. On the Hrafnkel's command deck, the sound made pict screens crack, instruments wavered, men fell to their knees, clutching their heads, blood seeping from noses. Russ stood very still. For a heartbeat, there was no humor in him, no bared teeth, only a predator's focus, honed to a razor's edge. Then his lips peeled back in a grin that showed too many teeth, that went a fraction too wide for a human face, that made even his wolf guard shift their weight. "At last," he murmured, "a worthy beast." He did not wait for Guilliman's carefully calculated orders. He did not check with segmentum commands or consider the long arcs of supply. He turned to the helmsman, to the navigators locked in their tower, to the Vox officers clinging to their stations. "Change heading," he said. "All ships, all claws. The corridor we bled for is open. We take it. We run toward that voice." "Lord," an admiral began, sweat beading on his brow. "There are safer campaigns marked, nodes we can cut without drawing that kind of—" Russ's gaze flicked to him, and the words died in his mouth. "There is no safer war than the one where your enemy's throat is in reach," the Wolf King said. "We have killed their pups, their champions, their hosts. Now their hound comes for us. We answer. Or what are we?" The Admiral bowed his head, throat working. "Course laid in, Lord," the navigator intoned from the Vox, his voice distant and strange. "The storm ahead is a sea of blood. The currents are rage, but they are currents. They can be ridden." "Good," Russ said. "Let us see whether a dog of corn can drown a wolf." The void pack turned. Engines roared as ships rolled in unison, vectors changing, prows swinging toward a patch of void that boiled with warp scars. The corridor Guilliman's blood sacrifice had brought them opened ahead, a relatively stable channel through the maelstrom, its edges lit with the glow of distant sorcerous contradictions. They plunged into it with all flags flying, guns hot, hulls singing. Behind them, the worlds they could have saved groaned under renewed attacks. Before them, a light flared, red and terrible, the mark of a system being torn apart by the Red Angel's presence. It was a cluster of worlds once, planets that had known commerce and prayer and war. Now, from the Void Pack's vantage, they were candles in the dark, each flame guttering under a wind of rage. One burned in bands, its equator a ring of fire where continents had been chain-cut apart by orbital bombardment. Another had gone dark entirely, its atmosphere boiled away, leaving only a glowing mantle of molten rock and a halo of skulls in orbit. Vox fragments from a third spoke of chain-axe massacres so absolute that the hives themselves choked on the bodies piled in their arteries. Angron's legions ran through those worlds like rabid beasts, their chain blades singing, their armor permanently slick. For every billion souls extinguished, his presence in the warp swelled, a red corona around the already grotesque bulk of his demon form. Russ saw it, felt it, breathed it in. "The stage is set," he said to his assembled Jarls, to Njal with his storm-worn staff, to admirals and generals and knights who would live or die by his call. The Red Angel dances on the corpses of worlds. We go to break his legs. The Void Pack howled as one and burned toward the bloodlit system, a pack of wolves running full tilt into the heart of a storm. Scalathrax Reborn was not a system. It was a scream given form. The warp bled there without pause, turning the void between its worlds into a soup of red light and drifting bone. Chains of demon taint wrapped each planet, moon, and orphaned rock in shackles of hate. The orbits themselves had been dragged from their rightful paths, locked instead into patterns more pleasing to the blood god's priests. Every world was a battlefield, every moon an execution ground, every asteroid a shard in an altar of rage strewn with corpses beyond counting. Angron had made it so. The Red Angel's presence warped everything. Planets that had once known temperate climates and predictable seasons now boiled beneath skies the color of opened veins. Continents had been peeled back like scabs, exposing glowing mantle blood that spewed up in fountains. Mountain ranges had been planned flat to make room for skull cairns taller than Hive. Spires. Oceans steamed, thick with fat and offal, tides running crimson on shores made of crushed bone. As the Void Pack dropped out of the corridor, Gilliman's sacrifice had bought them. One of those worlds died. It had been a hive planet once. Its name barely mattered anymore, a string of syllables lost under the weight of what had been done to it. From orbit, it had looked like so many others, a bruise of grey metal, its surface a maze of habstacks and manufactoria, its atmosphere choked with spume from a billion chimneys. Under Angron, it burned. World-eater warbands ran like rabid dogs through its lower levels, chain axes whining, boots sending up sprays of flesh pulp with every step. Macro-hab blocks split open under the impact of orbital shells and demon engines, collapsing in cascades that crushed entire districts. Rivers of blood ran from spires taller than mountains, pouring from shattered cathedra and throne halls in falls that stained the air red. Orbital augurs tried to count. They tracked thermal signatures as they winked out, one after another, a blizzard of vanishing life signs. They updated casualty projections as Hive Arabiata vanished beneath tides of Chainblade and Fang. The numbers climbed past 1 billion, past 5 billion, past 10 billion. Beyond that, the cogitators began to blur the digits, their machine spirits hissing in static as they lost the capacity to render such slaughter in any meaningful way. The day Leman Russ arrived in Scalathrax Reborn, that hive world died in a span of hours. Its last screams echoed through the warp like a bell struck one final time before shattering. The Void Pack committed everything. Space Wolves battle barges opened their launch bays, disgorging waves of Thunderhawks and drop pods. Successor chapter vessels followed suit, their sleeker lines and newer heraldry lost under the soot and blood that already stained their hulls. Imperial Navy capital ships swung into firing arcs, lance, batteries swinging outward, their machine spirits eager to burn. Titan Legios walked from Mechanicus holds in the bellies of Arch Mechanicus vessels, striding across void gantries and gravsling platforms to board landing craft built to bear their impossible weight. Night walkers knelt in embarkation cradles, manes of purity seals whipping in recycled air as their pilots linked into their thrones. Sisters of Silence assembled in grim silence aboard black ships that had been diverted from their usual harvests, their null auras like patches of dead space in the warp's furious current. Billions of guardsmen stood ready at the troop bay doors, hearing nothing of the fleet orders beyond the constant background roar of the Wolf King's howl echoing through the hulls. Auxiliary cohorts, stormtrooper contingents, Skitarii maniples, all waited in their own mechanical disciplines. Even reality seemed to flex under the strain. Psychic pressure pressed in on all sides, the warp and the minds within it straining around the massed presence of so many warriors and weapons. Astropaths bled from nose and ears, teeth clenched as they fought to keep channels open. Navigators clutched at their ocular wards, seeing not the calm light of the Astronomicon, but a churning darkness, full of red nails and iron chains. Then the signal came. "Drop!" Russ said, his voice carried along every channel that mattered. They fell. Assault waves burned through the red-tinged atmosphere of Scalathrax Reborn's chosen altar world, leaving contrails of black smoke and warp fire. Drop pods hammered into the ground in patterns honed over millennia of war. Tactical and assault squads disgorging in storms of ceramite and roaring engines. Larger craft carried tanks and artillery down in slabs, slamming them onto ground already trembling with distant impacts. Across a continent-wide front, wolves met world eaters. The traitor legion came like a tide of red armor and brass trim, their white crests spattered with gore, their chain axes already choked with meat. They screamed praises to the blood god, their vox units transmitting nothing but wordless rage and guttural oaths. Around them, mortal cultists surged, bare chests carved with sigils, hands clutching whatever blades they could find. Space wolves crashed into them in a counter-tide of grey and bone, their war howls answering the traitors' bellowed rage. Frost blades glittered in the red light, leaving trails of hoar frost in the heated air. Chainswords and wolf claws tore and bit. Bolters roared, spitting death at point-blank range into snarling helms. The ground could not stand the strain. Chains of impact shocks ran through the crust as war machines exchanged fire. Titan footfalls sent fractures racing outward. Artillery barrages pounded the same lines again and again until the rock itself grew tired of holding together. In some places, entire landmasses cracked along ancient fault lines, the crust splitting, seas of gore and warp-tainted water pouring into the new fissures. Plate shifts triggered quakes that toppled spires of skulls and sent fortresses sliding into oceans that steamed red. Men drowned in blood god seas, their last sights the silhouettes of Astartes locked in combat on collapsing ridges. Above one such broken continent, where the slagged remains of cities had been shaped into a single, world-spanning altar of skulls and bone, two monsters came together. The altar's surface was an uneven plain of craniums, jawbones, femurs, and vertebrae, fused together by pressure and the weight of uncounted corpses. It crunched underfoot, cracking, dust of old death rising with every step. Rivers of fresh blood threaded between the heaps, running downhill toward pits where it collected in lakes that had no bottom. Angron stood at the altar's heart. He was immense, even by the warped standards of the eye. His body was a slab of brass and scarred meat, wounds old and new, crisscrossing his flesh like the tracks of a planet's war history. Nails of black iron and demon metal jutted from his scalp in a crown driven into his skull, each one a conduit for pain and rage. His eyes burned like coals in a furnace filled with flayed souls. Axes hung heavy in his fists, each blade a field of writhing faces, their mouths opening in continuous screams. He turned as Russ approached, the skulls under his massive feet cracking like ice. "Wolf!" he roared, the word an impact that made skull piles slump, and warriors at the altar's distant edge clap hands to their ears. "All-Father's dog, you come." Leman Russ walked across the altar, spear in his hand, cloak whipping in the wind created by the convulsing atmosphere. Daemon ichor and human blood crusted his armor, the furs across his shoulders stiff with it. His eyes were bright, the lupine gleam in them almost visible even in the red wash of the sky. "I come," he said. "I heard there was a beast here that needed putting down." Angron's laugh was a jagged, broken thing, "I am free," he bellowed. "No chains, no master, only rage. What are you? Still wearing the All-Father's collar, still barking when the cohort bookman whistles?" Russ tilted his head, as if considering. "I see chains," he said, voice mild. "I see nails driven into your skull. I see a god's leash in every roar. You were the Emperor's failed hound, Angron. You let your anger master you. Now you dance for another." The Red Angel screamed. The axes surged with new light, the faces on their blades howling louder, their mouths opening wide in agony. He charged, each step a hammer blow, skulls exploding beneath his feet, bone dust fountaining. Russ met him. Their first clash shattered mountains at the altar's edges. Russ's spear leapt to parry one axe, the impact sending a shockwave through his arm that would have pulped a lesser giant. The other axe came in low, blades screeching, across rune-warded ceramite, ripping a chunk of plating from his pauldron and taking a mouthful of flesh with it. Blood sprayed in a wide arc, steaming where it hit the burning air. Russ twisted, driving his spear point toward Angron's chest. The blade punched through demon flesh that slicked and tried to ooze away from it, absorb not just blood, but something deeper, a scrap of the rage bound into the Red Angel's ribcage. Angron howled, backhanding the spear aside, wrenching it free in a spray of ichor. Each blow they traded tore the world. Shockwaves rippled across the altar, rolling outward to where space wolves and world eaters were locked in their own slaughter. Entire squads were paced at the periphery of impacts, armor and flesh liquefied by the force. Titans staggered on the horizon, their void shields flickering as unseen hands slapped at them. Seas of gore frothed, waves rising and falling in response to the duel. They fought across the altar, carving paths, through piles of skulls, using hillocks made from the dead of entire worlds as stepping stones. Angron's axes bit deep. They ripped chunks of ceramite and flesh from Russ's torso, opening wounds that exposed rib and gene-wrought muscle. Each cut burned, the demon weapons trying to infect the flesh with their patron's rage. Russ grunted, forced to give ground, boots slipping on marrow and blood. He gave ground in the directions he chose. The altar was not uniform. Under its crust of bone, warp nodes pulsed, places where Angron's own rituals had tied reality and unreality together, focusing rage into nexus points that amplified his presence. Russ had seen them from orbit, had felt them from the moment his boots touched the skulls. To most eyes, they were invisible. To him, they were scent and taste, and a tingle at the edge of perception. He drew Angron across them. Every time the Red Angel's fury peaked, Angron's roar shaking the air, Russ twisted, pivoted, baiting him into overextension. He leapt aside at the last possible moment, letting those wild, god-swollen blows fall where the nexus lines were thickest. The results were biblical. At one node, an axe strike intended for Russ instead bit deep into the altar, slamming into a warp line that ran down into the planet's molten heart. The connection snapped. A geyser of blood and screaming light erupted, hurling a pillar of demon fire into the sky. An entire cohort of lesser demons stationed there, as Angron's honor guard thrashed and came apart, their forms tearing into ribbons as the surge overloaded their bindings. At another, the fury of Angron's blow rebounded through the network of rage he had woven into the crust. A dozen demon engines in distant battles froze mid-charge, their gears grinding before imploding, their bound entities dragged shrieking into the cracks Russ had created. World Eaters near those engines were bathed in the resulting psychic backwash, their brains liquefying inside their helms, blood and grey matter pouring from their eye lenses. Russ saw each chain reaction in the edge of his vision, in the sudden slackening of pressure from one direction or the other, in the way the warp taste in his mouth shifted. He drove Angron on. They crashed through a tower of fused skulls, sending it avalanching down onto the battlefield below. burying loyalist and traitor alike in a storm of broken bone. They smashed through the husk of a wrecked titan that had been dragged up as just another ornament, its once proud visage now a cracked mask under their boots. They fought in sprays of their own and each other's blood. Between strikes, they spoke. "You were always this," Russ snarled, spear-haft shuddering in his hands as he caught an axe cut that would have split him from collar to groin. A beast that needed a hand on its collar. Our father tried. He thought he could make a blade out of a rabid dog. Look at you now, a pet for a worse, master. Angron's laughter was flecks of spittle and blood and warp fire. "You know nothing of chains," he roared. "You had a world, you had a people. I had gulag stars and slave collars. I had my own brother's hands holding me down while they drilled lessons into me. Brotherhood is lies. Rage is true." He brought both axes down in an overhand blow that cracked the altar's surface for leagues, the impact sending a shock through Russ's arms that numbed them to the shoulder. Russ rolled aside, momentum dragging him across a ridge of skulls, bone cutting into exposed flesh. He spat blood, grinned through it. "I buried my father's enemies in his name," he said. "I have spent 10,000 years burying the enemies of men, gods and demons and things without words. You rage because you cannot think of anything else to be. I hunt because I choose to." The battle raged on all around them. Space wolves and world eaters tore at each other in little mockeries of the giants' duel. Guard regiments tried to advance through the chaos, their lines shattered, their officers cut down by stray arcs of demon weapon and falling debris. Knights and titans exchanged fire over rivers of blood, their shots marking the backdrop of the Primarch's fight with pillars of flame. At last, Russ saw his opening. The warp had been building toward a surge. He felt it in the hairs on his arms, in the way the skulls underfoot vibrated, in the sudden sharpness of the taste of iron on his tongue. The network of nodes Angron had forged across the system, a web of rage and sacrifice, was reaching some critical peak. If it flared unchecked, it would cook the minds of every mortal on the battlefield and birth a tide of fresh demons that even the Void Pack could not stem. Or it could be used. Russ baited Angron one last time, letting the Red Angel hammer him back toward the central shrine, a monstrous construction of fused skulls that rose from the altar like a continent in its own right. At its apex, where uncounted champion skulls had been set in careful patterns, the warp node burned brightest, a wound in reality pulsing in time with Angron's roars. The demon Primarch lunged, axes raised high. Russ stepped in. He twisted under the arcs of the blades, feeling one kiss the top of his helm, tearing away the wolf crest and peeling back ceramite. Pain flared, hot and sharp, followed by the cool rush of his gene-crafted blood trying to clot and knit. He ignored it. His focus narrowed to the span of a heartbeat and the space between one massive brass rib and another. He drove the spear of Russ forward with everything he had. The blade punched through Angron's chest, through demon flesh and warp-congealed muscle, through glands swollen with rage, through a heart that had never known calm. It burst from the Red Angel's back in a spray of black and red fire, impaling him against the shrine of skulls. The force of the impact drove them, both backward, bone cracking, as the shrine took their combined weight. Angron screamed. It was not his usual bellow, not the constant roar of rage. It was something rawer, thinner, edged with surprise and a pain he had not felt since nails were driven into his skull on another world, another lifetime. The axes fell from his hands, embedding themselves in the skulls at his sides, their blades still twitching. Russ stepped in close, one hand clamped around the spear haft, the other braced against Angron's throat. He threw his head back and howled. It was a Fenrisian curse, an ancient thing spoken in a tongue the Imperium had never bothered to fully catalogue. It called on winter and the long dark, on the first wolves that had hunted the ice wastes before man had ever set foot on Fenris, on the cold that cracked stone and the hunger that stripped worlds. Runes flared along the spear in answer, carved lines filling with a light that was not warp and not wholly real space. The warp surged. Instead of boiling outward in a storm that would have drowned friend and foe alike, the surge bent. The curse hooked it, dragged it, focused it down along the path carved by Russ's spear. Angron became a conduit. For a moment, the Red Angel was a vessel for something that did not love rage or blood, something old and cold and made of the spaces between hunts. His form tore. Brass and flesh came apart in ribbons, pulled toward the spear point. The nails in his skull screamed as they were dragged free, each one carrying a piece of his bound essence with it. His axes shattered, the bound souls within them howling free and then vanishing, scattered like sparks in a gale. The hate in his eyes burned brighter, then dimmed, then was gone. The sound of his departure was not a detonation. It was a strangled whimper at a pitch that only demons and Primarchs could hear. Angron disappeared. The spear of Russ drove all the way into the Shrine of Skulls, its point punching through layers of bone and whatever foundation lay beneath. The Red Angel's physical form collapsed into ash and scraps of blackening brass that fell in a slow rain around Russ's feet. The warp tore where he had been, a hole punched in the heart of the rage web. For a span of breaths that felt like an eternity, there was a vacuum there, a silence where there had always been screaming. Then the hole sealed. The blood god did not die. Such a thing was beyond even a Primarch who had learned to kill princes of the warp. But a piece of Angron's manifested will was gone, dragged down and bound in currents he could not easily break. For 100 years, the Red Angel would howl impotently in the depths, his essence struggling to re-knit, his attention forced elsewhere. The effect on Scalathrax Reborn was immediate. The warp storm collapsed. The red haze in the sky thinned, then tore like cloth, revealing the cold stars beyond. Demon legions flickered and vanished as their anchor in the real was ripped away. Greater entities howled, reaching clawed hands for purchase, only to find nothing to latch onto. They were pulled back into the immaterium, shrieking in frustration. On the ground, demonic engines froze mid-charge, their frames crumbling without the will holding them together. Lesser demons burst like overripe fruit, showering battlefields with black rain that steamed where it hit. Cultists dropped, their eyes rolling back in their heads as the voices that had driven them fell silent all at once. The noise of battle faded to the crackle of fires and the labored breathing of survivors. Scalathrax Reborn was dead. The planets of the system were glassed, their surfaces a mix of slag and fused bone. The altar world where Russ had fought was a cracked shell, the skulls that had formed its surface fused into a single grotesque plane by the energies unleashed. The warp scars that had crowned the system dimmed, their once vivid red reduced to faint bruises at the edge of perception. In orbit, the stars themselves seemed to have lost some of their light, as if the system had taken too much from them during its time as an altar, and now they burned lower in exhausted protest. The survivors were not whole. Guard regiments staggered through streets filled with statues of glassed corpses, their faces locked in screams. Some laughed at nothing, their minds broken by what they had seen. Others spoke only in monotone, repeating the same prayers over and over until their throats were raw. Wolves who had fought on the altar came away with new scars that pulsed faintly with warp echoes, their dreams filled with the memory of Angron's scream. Those few mortals left in the system who had never taken up arms, who had hidden under floors or in vents, emerged into a silence so total that it felt like a physical weight. Many did not last long. Some walked back into the flames, rather than contemplate a universe that could give birth to such horror and then snuff it out so completely. Scalathrax Reborn became a monument, not of triumph, Though the sagas would sing of Russ banishing the Red Angel for 100 years, of a demon Primarch broken on a shrine of skulls, it was a monument to cost, to what it meant when one Primarch turned his full attention and fury on another and did not stop until the world under their feet and the sky above their heads were both shattered. The Wolf King stood alone for a while on the cooling altar, the spear of Russ still buried deep in the shrine, his breath steaming in the chill that followed the storm. Blood, his and others, dried on his skin in stiff plates. The wind shifted, carrying away the last ash of Angron's manifested form. He looked up at the dimmed stars. One more god's hound sent whimpering, he said to no one in particular. Plenty left. Then he wrenched his spear free, bone cracking around it, and turned back toward the waiting void pack, ready to lead them into whatever hunts the dark still held. In the vaults of the administratum, where light rarely reached, scribes broke. They sat in endless rows, hunched over parchment and data slate, their fingers stained with ink, and their eyes red from staring at flickering rune displays. The Wolftime campaigns poured through their chambers in the form of casualty reports and fleet losses, planetary status updates and tithe revisions. They tried to make sense of it, to give the ruin a shape that could be rendered in neat columns. The numbers refused to obey. A hive here, wiped clean of life in a span of hours. A fortress world there, its population rendered into shell fragments and crater dust. Sectors marked as lost, their worlds tagged as uninhabitable, atmospheres corrupted beyond reclamation, crusts shattered down to magma, sectors marked as held only by the stubborn refusal of a few worlds to stop firing. The ink tallies crept up the margins of the ledgers, adding zero after zero until the digits blurred, until low trillions of dead looked no different to the eye than the millions that had seemed apocalyptic only a few centuries before. Some scribes began to see wolf heads in the clusters of runes, fanged jaws opening between a string of planetary designations and a note of exterminatus. Those ones were quietly removed, their ledgers reassigned, their fates left unrecorded. New men took their places, their hands still steady, their minds not yet cracked by trying to count the dead. The Imperium still stood, crippled, listing, bleeding from 100 million wounds, but standing. The warp storms still howled, the great rift still split the sky, but there were worlds that woke to see another dawn, even if that dawn was red. There were pilgrim lines that still wound toward shattered shrines. There were forges that still hammered out guns and armor. There were packs that still hunted. In the cold dark above Fenris, the Void Pack came home. They limped into the system, the howl of the Hrafnkel rolling before them like a storm wind. Their hulls were pitted and scorched, ossified demon bone clinging to their flanks like scars of some great disease that had half healed. Sections lay open to the void, sealed over with hasty plating, marked with fresh rune wards. Engine signatures flickered, some weak, some gone entirely, gaps in the formation where names would never be spoken again. Great companies that had once filled entire decks now took up a handful of compartments. There were banners that would not be raised again, more gaps along the wall of honor in the Fang's Hall than anyone had ever seen. Some companies had fewer brothers than a single pack had once claimed before the heresy. Their sagas, carved hastily into armor plates and ship bulkheads, were longer than any etched into stone for centuries. The ships made orbit on stuttering engines and bleeding reactors. Shuttle bays opened like wounds. Dropships descended through the atmospheric storms, their hulls blackened, the paint scorched from their icons. Thunderhawks groaned as they cut through the thin air, scarred wings fighting Fenris's winds. Lighters creaked and rattled, their holds packed with men who had not stood on solid ground since they left. The Fang opened its gates. Leman Russ walked among the survivors. He moved through the mustering halls and infirmaries, through hangars turned into field hospitals, and feasting halls turned into triage pits. Crippled warriors lined the walls, propped on cots or against stacked munitions, their armor cut away to reveal stumps bound in old bandages, faces half rebuilt from augmetic and scar. Half-mad guardsmen sat with their backs to the stone, staring at nothing, flinching at every raised voice. Russ did not walk like a savior. He walked like a butcher at a market, assessing the quality of the meat. He stopped before a space wolf whose armor ended at the waist, his lower body gone, his pale scars disappearing under the blanket that covered him. The warrior's hands still gripped the broken haft of an axe, fingers white. "Can you fight?" Russ asked. The warrior's eyes snapped into focus, bright with the remnant of battle lust. "I can swing an axe sitting down," he said. "I can shout orders. I can bite." Russ tilted his head, considering. He slammed the shaft of his spear once against the stone. "Then you will teach," he said. "Pups will learn from a warrior who left his legs on a demon's throat instead of running." He moved on. A guardsman stared up at him, eyes wide and ringed with bruised skin, laser gun clutched in hands that shook uncontrollably. His uniform hung off him, stained with so many other men's blood that its original color was guesswork. "How many worlds?" Russ asked him. "How many charges did you live through?" The man's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before words forced their way out. "Too many," he whispered. Russ watched him for a long moment. "You are done," he said at last. There was no malice in it, only finality. "You have hunted as far as you can. Stay here. Let Fenris's snow cover you. You would only die badly out there." He nodded to a nearby wolf priest. "Give him a clean death," Russ said. "He has earned that much." The guardsman flinched, then slumped in something like relief. Tears ran down his cheeks as the priest approached. Crozius lowered like a hammer of mercy. So it went. Men who still had the fire in their eyes, who snarled when they heard the word demon or traitor, were marked for redeployment. They would be reforged, their scars made into new sagas. Those whose fire had burned out entirely were given to the care of apothecaries and priests with guns. In this age, retirement was not considered a mercy. In the high halls of the Fang, old and young argued while the storm clawed at the walls. Logan Grimnar sat on his stone throne, his beard whiter than when Russ had first returned, his eyes heavy with the weight of all that had happened since. Ragnar Blackmane stood below, his mane bound back, his armor etched with fresh marks from Scalathrax and a dozen lesser hells. They spoke of the Wolf King. "He will drag us into damnation," Grimnar said, voice low but edged. "He teaches the men that anything less than absolute savagery is weakness, that mercy is meat to be eaten. There is a line, Ragnar. We stand on it, each time we choose to hold instead of burn. Russ has forgotten where that line lies." Ragnar's lips peeled back in a snarl that was half humor, half frustration. "That line burned when the rift tore the sky," he said. "We walk in a night where there are no half measures. You know this. You have seen worlds fall because high lords hesitated, because commanders worried about collateral scripture instead of cutting fast. I have also seen what happens when a blade has no sheath," Grimnar replied. "It cuts its wielder as often as its enemies. Russ does not see the men who will follow his example without his judgment. He sees only the kills ahead." Ragnar looked up at the great banners hanging from the rafters, at the gaps where some had been taken down and carried to the vaults in honor of great companies that no longer existed as such. "In this age," he said, "only such a beast can lead us. The foe does not hesitate. The warp does not pity. The traitors and their gods do not pause to count the cost. If we put a lesser creature at the head of the pack, we may have our consciences, but we will not have a legion." In the shadows beyond the torchlight, Leman Russ listened. He stood half-cloaked in darkness, the furs around his shoulders still stiff with old blood, the runes on his armor catching the firelight in flickers. He did not speak. He watched his old wolf lord and his young jarl argue about him, as if he were a presence carved into stone, rather than a living, breathing force. It pleased him, in a way he would never have admitted aloud, that they did not simply bow and scrape. It pleased him more that neither of them spoke of leaving the hunt. A message reached the Fang, carried through howling warp and treacherous channels, bearing the seal of the Lord Commander. The hololith flickered into being in the war hall, an armored figure in cerulean and gold, standing amid the rolling rune displays. Robu Gilliman's face was a little more lined than when Russ had last seen him in the flesh, the burden of holding together a crumbling empire etched deeper. The message was brief. "Your campaigns are barbaric," the regent said. "Your losses are unacceptable by any standard but your own. You crush not only the foe, but often the very worlds you set out to save. The Administratum curses your name. The Inquisition stays their hand only because you kill those they fear they will not reach in time." He paused, the lines of his mouth twitching briefly. "Your results are undeniable," he went on. "Demon princes banished, warp nexuses broken. Sectors that would have fallen still stand, though sometimes on shattered knees. You are doing what you were made to do. The Imperium still exists in places where it would not without your hunts." The hololith crackled as a warp eddy tried to disrupt it. Gilliman's image steadied. "Therefore," he said, "you are granted near absolute operational freedom in designated war zones, the darkest fronts, the most corrupted regions. You will coordinate enough that we do not trip over each other's campaigns, but I will not attempt to leash every stroke of your spear. The price is this: when I call you to a fight I deem vital, you answer. When I name a world that must not burn, you stay your hand, however much you itch to strike." The message ended with the sign of the Aquila, old habits unconsciously obeyed. Russ snorted. "He thinks he can steer a storm by shouting at it," he said to Njal, who stood at his shoulder. "Perhaps he can," the rune priest replied. "Perhaps he only needs to know where to stand, so that the worst of the debris flies past." Njal had his own concerns. The warp around Russ had taken on a shape. When the Wolf King walked the storm caves, the firelight bent oddly, shadows stretching in lupine forms that did not quite match the angles of the rock. When he led a charge, the psychic echo of it in the Sea of Souls was not just a flare of passion and violence, but something more focused, a pointed hunger that left claw marks on the currents. In their meditations, the rune priests saw a shape hunting in the immaterium, four-legged and long, its eyes twin voids of cold light, its jaw lined with teeth made of broken stars. "The warp watches him," Njal said in the council of his peers. "Every victory he grinds out sharpens its interest. We have made the eye bleed, and it has taken note. There is a hunger there now that was not there before. A curiosity." "You think we are making a god," one of the younger priests whispered. "A wolf god, born from the sagas and the kills and the fear of the foe." "There are already too many gods," Njal said, voice hard. "We do not need another. But the warp does not care what we need. It cares what we feed it. And we have been feeding it the idea of a hunter who cannot die, who kills its monsters and spits in its face." He looked toward the upper halls, where Russ's footfalls echoed faintly. "We must remind him," Njal said, "that he is a man, even if he is more than any other. If he forgets that, the thing in the warp will remember it for him." Another message from Gilliman came, more personal, more pointed. It spoke of Segmentum Solar, of the crumbling bastions around Terra, of the need for strong hands on the reins of the central war effort. It contained words like Lord Militant, High, Strategos, titles that had once belonged to men whose names were now dust. "You could sit at the heart," the regent said in the flickering hollow. You could command sectors with a word, direct fleets from the cradle of our father's dream. You could turn your hunts into something broader, something less dependent on your presence in every slaughter. Russ laughed in his face. Even through the distortion of the hollow, it was a raw, honest sound. "You want to collar me with a title," he said. "Put me in a palace so I can rot on a throne while the galaxy burns. No, Roboot. I have seen what sitting does to gods and men. I will not turn into another corpse on a chair while my sons learn to die without me." Gilliman's jaw tightened. "You cannot run forever," he said. "Even wolves must rest. Even storms burn out." "If I fall," Russ replied, "it will be with my teeth in something's throat, not with a quill in my hand. Keep your segmentum lords and your solars. I will take my wolves and range ahead of the pack. There are places where your Astronomicon is a rumor and your codex a myth. That is where we are needed." "Very well," Guilliman said. "Go, hunt. But remember our accord. When I call, answer." The hollow died. In the Fang's war hall, maps were unrolled and hololiths stabilized. Jarls and pack leaders gathered, some leaning on canes or crozier staves, some missing eyes, arms, entire halves of their bodies replaced by augmetic and scar tissue. The air hummed with anticipation and the low murmur of overlapping plans. Russ stood at the head of the table, spear point resting on the stone. "Here," he said, tapping a rune cluster that marked a swathe of space where the warp bled thicker than elsewhere. "Old eye scars, raider nests, places no fleet has gone and come back sane. We carve a path through this. We cut off half the blood supply to 3 enemy crusades. Here," he stabbed another point, further out, in the dark, between arms of the galaxy. "Whispers of a brother. Not the lion, not the regent, someone else. Something half seen, half sung in Xenos tongues. Maybe a ghost, maybe a trap, maybe a chance to put another blade back into our hand. Here," a third point, where tyrannid tendrils coiled and Necron tomb glyphs glimmered. "Larger beasts, herding creatures. If we do not harry them, they will swell until no wall will hold. We run along their flanks, we tear chunks out, we keep them snapping at ghosts instead of closing jaws on our worlds." Jarls argued over priorities, over which great company was strongest where, over which Night House had oaths tied to which regions. Mortal commanders spoke of supply lines and the limits of fuel and flesh. Russ listened, eyes bright, nostrils flaring as if he could already smell the battles to come. In the end, they traced lines out from Fenris like claw marks. New crusade routes, if such a word could be applied to. Paths that had no clear end and no promise of return. Arcs that curved through the worst the galaxy had to offer, linking warzone to warzone, threat to threat. Some doubled back toward relatively safer regions, giving Russ options to answer Gilliman's calls without abandoning his own hunts. Others ran straight into the kind of dark, where even the warp hesitated to look. The last feasts were held, meat and mead and blood and oaths. Then the ships were loaded again, holds filling with men who had barely tasted home before being thrust back into steel coffins. On a night when the skull in the sky had sunk behind horizons of storm cloud and the stars burned with a hard, pitiless light, Fenris watched its sons leave. Strike cruisers and battle barges tore themselves free from the world's pull, engines flaring blue-white. Their hulls were ancient and scarred, the wolf-head sigils on their prows worn by fire and time, but the rune wards along their sides burned fresh, traced by rune. Priests whose hands still shook from visions of the warp thing that hunted their lord. They formed up above the Fang, sled dogs ready for the shout. Vox howls rolled over the world, answered from below by the voices of those who would remain, by the world wolves pacing the ice floes, by the echoes in the stone of the mountain itself. Then they were gone. Flashes of translation lit the upper atmosphere, icy blue flames that tore holes in the night for heartbeats before reality patched over them. The ships vanished into the dark, into the broken corridors of warp and real space where their kills waited. The echoes of their departure lingered in the thin air, a fading taste of ozone and promethium and old blood. In some far future, in a fortress where books and data slates are hoarded like relics, a chronicler will set down quill or key and stare long at a half-filled page. He will write, in ink that never quite dries. The wolf time did not end when the Wolf King returned. The rift did not close, the demons did not flee, the traitors did not kneel. There was no great victory, no single battle where the banners of the enemy were cast down and the Imperium stood whole again. What it gained was a hunter, savage enough to survive the age. For a while longer, the species our Emperor raised from the mud had teeth sharp enough to bite back. Entire sectors died so that a corridor could be opened. Low trillions went into the furnaces of liberation and the glassing of altars. The line between necessary cruelty and simple butchery blurred until only the gods could tell the difference, and they did not care. We paid with our soul for the privilege of continuing to exist. Out in the dark, where the Astronomicon is faint and the names on our charts are written in the sagas of wolves rather than in administratum ink, something hunts the things that hunt us. It wears the face of a Primarch and the cloak of a beast. In the warp, a shadow shaped like a wolf's head runs. Alongside it, growing stronger with every scream and every kill. The story does not end. It cannot while the galaxy still turns. It is only that, for a time, the howl of the pack is louder than the laughter of the gods.